The crystal champagne flute felt cool against my palm as I endured another evening of thinly veiled insults in my in-laws' sprawling lakeside mansion in Minneapolis. "Another small order this month, Jessica?" My father-in-law Robert snickered, swirling his aged whiskey. "When are you going to admit that little candle business is just a hobby?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I forced a polite smile, the same one I'd perfected over 3 years of marriage to their son Daniel. Across the ornate dining table, my husband shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent as his parents continued. "At least Daniel has a real career," Margaret, my mother-in-law, added with practiced concern in her voice. She adjusted her pearl necklace. The one she'd pointedly mentioned cost more than my first year of business expenses. "Not everyone is cut out for success in business, dear." If only they knew that the little candle business they'd dismissed for years had just secured distribution in the country's largest home goods retailer. If only they knew that the modest sales figures Daniel reported to them were from my small, local boutique, just one branch of what had become Luminous Home Goods, now valued at $8 million. The irony was delicious, almost as rich as the crème brûlée Margaret had imported from her favorite Parisian bakery. For 3 years, I'd maintained this charade at Daniel's insistence. "They're old-fashioned," he'd explained early in our relationship. "They wouldn't understand a son whose wife out-earns him." At first, it seemed a small price to pay for harmony. Now, as I sat silently through another evening of their condescension, the weight of the deception felt suffocating. What Margaret and Robert Wilson didn't know was that their luxury lake house, their European vacations, the private school tuition for their youngest daughter, all were increasingly financed by the hobby they mocked over imported spirits. Daniel's investment banking career had faltered 2 years ago after his firm downsized. Rather than tell his status-obsessed parents, he'd asked me to help, temporarily, maintain appearances. Temporary had stretched into 24 months of secret payments, with Daniel growing more comfortable with the arrangement with each passing month. Jessica was actually turned down for a small business loan again, Daniel offered, the lie flowing easily from his lips as he reached for more wine. "Dad, didn't you say your golf buddy works at First National? Maybe he could put in a word?" Robert waved dismissively. "No point throwing good money after bad. Besides, women just don't have the killer instinct for serious business." I caught Daniel's eye across the table, searching for any sign of the man I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd once admired my determination and business acumen. Instead, I found only complicity as he nodded along with his father's outdated pronouncements. Little did they know that tomorrow I had a meeting with my business managers to review our nationwide expansion plan. Little did they know that the documents in my home office safe would change everything about this carefully maintained facade. The morning after the dinner, I sat in my real office. Not the small room above our garage that the Wilsons had seen, but the renovated warehouse in downtown Minneapolis that served as Luminous headquarters. The space hummed with the energy of 30 employees, none of whom knew that their CEO's in-laws thought she sold candles at farmers' markets. "The numbers from the spring collection are exceptional," said Natalie, my operations director and closest confidant. She slid a folder across my desk, her expression serious. "But we need to discuss the cash flow issue." I nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. The private payments to the Wilsons, Daniel's loans to his parents, the vacations, the country, club memberships had grown from a temporary solution to a significant financial drain. "I've been tracking everything," I replied, pulling out my personal records. For 18 months, I documented every request, every transfer, every lie. It's time to make some changes. The pattern had become clear. What started as helping, Daniel's save face had morphed into something more insidious. Robert's investment mistakes had apparently left their finances more precarious than their lifestyle suggested. My loans to help them through rough patches never seemed to end, and Daniel had grown increasingly defensive when I asked questions. "Have you talked to Daniel about the boundary plan?" Natalie asked, her concern evident. She'd been there since the beginning, helping me build Luminous from my kitchen table to national distribution. "Tonight," I confirmed, reviewing the comprehensive financial analysis we'd prepared. "After I speak with the lawyer." Attorney Sharon Blake welcomed me into her office that afternoon, reviewing the documents I'd brought. "These payments weren't formally documented as loans," she observed, looking up from the pile of statements. "Daniel called them temporary help for his parents," I explained. "But I've kept meticulous records of every conversation, every transfer." Sharon nodded thoughtfully. "And your business, the operating agreement gives you full decision-making. Authority?" "Yes, Daniel wanted no part of it when it was just candles. His name appears nowhere in the business documentation." "And the house? Other assets?" I slid another folder across the desk. "Separate property, documented before marriage." Daniel insisted, ironically to protect his assets from my risky business venture. As Sharon reviewed everything, I explained my plan. Not revenge, but a restoration of boundaries. A reclaiming of truth. Sharon's occasional nods confirmed what I already knew. The path forward was clear, if difficult. That evening, I sat in our home office, the real one, not the performative space we showed the Wilsons. When Daniel arrived, his expression told me he already suspected something had changed. "Your father called about the down payment for their new boat," I said without preamble. "That would be the third major purchase this year that we've subsidized." Daniel loosened his tie, reaching for the defensive anger that had become his default. "They've hit a rough patch. It's temporary." "You've been saying that for 2 years, Daniel." I pushed the financial summary across the desk. "This isn't temporary. It's a lifestyle we're financing." The color drained from his face as he saw the total. Nearly $300,000 over 2 years, all categorized and documented. They're my parents, Jessica. What am I supposed to do? Let them lose their status? Their friends would what? Discover they've been living beyond their means? I kept my voice level. "We need to talk about the national distribution deal and about telling your parents the truth." The argument that followed was both predictable and revealing. Daniel's concern centered entirely around appearances, his parents' expectations, the family reputation. Not once did he mention partnership, truth, or our future together. By midnight, a line had been drawn. I would announce the national deal next week. The Wilsons would be told the truth about both my business and the state of their finances, and the systematic financing of their lifestyle would end. What I didn't share with Daniel was the contingency plan already in motion, the separate accounts established, the business protections implemented, and the exit strategy prepared with Sharon's guidance if Daniel chose his parents' illusions over our marriage's reality. Sleep came uneasily that night, but with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. In 1 week, everything would change. Sunday dinner at the Wilson estate arrived with picture-perfect weather and storm clouds gathering. In my mind, I'd chosen my outfit carefully, not the deliberately understated clothes I typically wore to these gatherings, but the tailored designer suit I'd worn to sign the national distribution deal. "My goodness, someone's dressed to impress," Margaret commented as we arrived, her eyes cataloging the cost of my attire with unsettling precision. Daniel had barely spoken to me all week, alternating between anger and desperate bargaining. He'd promised changes, boundaries, honesty, all while secretly calling his parents to assure them nothing would change. I knew because they'd accidentally called my business line instead of my personal phone, leaving a voicemail that confirmed every suspicion. Robert was holding court in the living room, regaling their friends the Palmers with tales of his financial wisdom. "Diversification is key," he proclaimed, gesturing with his crystal tumbler. That's how we maintain our lifestyle through any market fluctuation. I took a deliberate breath, feeling Natalie's last text message burning in my pocket. Everything's ready. Your choice now. Actually, I said, my voice carrying across the room with unexpected authority, I'd love to discuss diversification. Robert! Particularly how Luminous Home Goods has diversified from candles into home fragrances, textiles, and decorative items. The conversation halted. Daniel froze beside me, his knuckles white around his drink. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica has some exciting news, Daniel managed, attempting to regain control of the narrative. We have exciting news, I corrected gently. Luminous, my company, has just signed a national distribution agreement. We're projecting 8 figures in revenue next year. Margaret laughed uncomfortably. Surely you mean your little candle hobby? I mean my company with 30 employees and manufacturing partnerships in 3 states, I replied, maintaining steady eye contact. The company that has been, unfortunately, financing a significant portion of this lifestyle for the past 2 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert's face flushed crimson, while Margaret's practiced smile faltered for the first time in my memory. Daniel, what is she talking about? Robert demanded. I placed a folder on the coffee table, copies of transfers, payments, and loans, all meticulously documented. Daniel has been struggling since the downsizing at his firm. Rather than adjust your expectations or lifestyle, he's been using my business success to maintain appearances. The Palmers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in their drinks. This is hardly the time, Daniel began. It's exactly the time, I interrupted. Before the new boat is purchased, before the European vacation is booked, before another year passes in this unhealthy dynamic. What followed was both painful and necessary. The careful facade the Wilsons had maintained in their social circle began crumbling as the reality of their financial situation was laid bare. Daniel alternated between anger and embarrassment as years of deception unraveled in a single evening. We've done everything for Daniel, given him every advantage, Margaret finally said, tears threatening her perfect makeup. And this is how he repays us? By letting his wife humiliate us? This isn't about humiliation, I replied firmly. It's about honesty and boundaries. Moving forward, Luminous will no longer be financing your lifestyle. Daniel and I will be establishing clear financial boundaries as we decide what our future looks like. Robert, recovering from the initial shock, attempted to reassert control. Now, see here, young lady. No, I said simply. The time for me seeing and silently accepting is over. I've prepared information about financial counseling services and realistic budgeting based on your actual income. What you do with that information is your choice. As we left the stunned silence of the Wilson estate, Daniel finally spoke. You've destroyed my family. I looked at him with genuine compassion. Your family was destroying itself with lies. Sometimes things need to break before they can be rebuilt honestly. The choice now lay before him, and before me, more clearly than ever before. The weeks following the revelation dinner unfolded with the inevitability of dominoes falling. The first domino. Robert and Margaret canceled their European vacation, claiming suddenly they preferred exploring locally this year. Daniel moved into our guest room, our conversations strained but increasingly honest. The anger had given way to something more complex. Grief for the illusion he'd maintained. Fear of an identity not defined by his parents' approval. Dad called, he said one evening, standing in the doorway of my home office. They're selling the boat. I nodded, continuing to review quarterly projections. That seems like a reasonable financial decision. He also asked if I could recommend a financial advisor. Daniel's voice carried a note of bewilderment. Said he should have listened years ago when I suggested they consult someone. The second domino. Margaret's carefully cultivated social circle began to fracture as the Wilsons scaled back their entertaining. Without elaborate dinner parties and sponsored charity tables, some friendships proved remarkably shallow. "Mom's upset about the country club gossip," Daniel reported after a tense phone call. "Apparently, the Palmers have been talking." "Gossip fades," I replied. "Financial stability lasts." The third domino fell when Robert reluctantly listed their lake house, the crown jewel of their curated image. The market was favorable. The sale would eliminate their largest debt and provide a cushion as they right-sized their lifestyle. Throughout this cascade, I maintained professional distance, neither gloating nor rescuing. This was their journey to navigate, their reality to accept. My focus remained on Luminous, now expanding operations with the national rollout. 6 weeks after the revelation dinner, Margaret called me directly, a first in our relationship. "I need to understand," she said without preamble. "How did you build this business while we never noticed?" The conversation that followed was surprisingly vulnerable. I explained the early years, the strategic decisions, the reinvestment of profits rather than displays of wealth. "We thought success looked like what we showed the world," she admitted quietly. "Big house, right memberships, appearances maintained, at all costs." "Success looks different to different people," I offered. "For me, it's building something sustainable." The most significant domino fell on a Tuesday afternoon when Daniel came to my office, my actual headquarters, for the first time. He walked through the space with new eyes, seeing not just a candle hobby, but the thriving business I'd created. "I've been living a lie," he said, as we sat in my conference room. "Not just with them, but with myself. About what success means. About what I want." The man before me seemed simultaneously familiar and new. The person I'd fallen in love with emerging from behind the facade he'd maintained to please his parents. "I've spoken with a therapist," he continued, "and a career counselor. Banking was always Dad's plan for me, not mine." As Daniel explored his authentic interests and Robert and Margaret adjusted to their new financial reality, something unexpected happened. The relationships, stripped of pretense and financial entanglement, began to heal in more honest ways. The final domino. Robert and Margaret bought tickets to the official Luminous National Launch event, not as benefactors or investors, but as family members genuinely interested in understanding this business that had grown while they weren't looking. 6 months after that pivotal Sunday dinner, I stood at the podium during Luminous's national retailer launch event. The company had transformed, and so had the people connected to it. "Success isn't about appearances," I told the gathered employees, partners, and family members. "It's about building something sustainable that improves lives, including your own." From the front row, Daniel watched with genuine pride, not the performative support of previous years, but authentic admiration. Beside him sat Robert and Margaret, almost unrecognizable from the people who had dismissed my little candle hobby for years. The Wilsons had downsized to a comfortable condo, embracing a lifestyle aligned with their actual resources. Robert had reluctantly accepted financial counseling, discovering that authentic financial management brought more security than the illusion of wealth ever had. "Your mother is taking business classes," Daniel had informed me with disbelief a week earlier. "Says she wants to understand balance sheets better." The transformation extended beyond finances. Margaret had begun volunteering at a women's business mentorship program, her social connections now based on meaningful contribution rather than conspicuous consumption. Daniel had found unexpected fulfillment teaching business courses at the community college, his favorite being financial honesty and family dynamics. The painful revelation had ultimately freed him to discover his authentic interests and talents. Our marriage, nearly broken by years of deception, was slowly rebuilding on a foundation of honesty. The guest room had eventually emptied as Daniel, and I began the careful work of redefining our partnership. After the launch event, Margaret approached me with uncharacteristic humility. "I was wrong about you," she said simply, "and wrong about what success looks like." "We were all participating in an illusion," I replied. "Breaking free was necessary for everyone." The boundaries I'd established had held firm. No more financing their lifestyle, no more enabling financial fiction. Yet something unexpected had grown in place of the unhealthy dynamic: mutual respect. Robert had recently called with a business idea, not seeking funding but genuine feedback. "You've built something real," he'd acknowledged. "I should have been learning from you instead of dismissing you." As our family gathered to celebrate the national launch, a genuine celebration, not a performance for others, I reflected on the journey. Setting boundaries hadn't been about punishment or revenge. It had been about creating space for something healthier to grow. "A toast," Robert offered, raising his glass. A modest wine now, not the ostentatious spirits of previous gatherings. "To Jessica, who had the courage to tell the truth when the rest of us were hiding from it." Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, our private signal of partnership restored. The boundaries I'd set had changed everything, not by destroying relationships, but by creating the possibility for authentic ones to finally emerge. The painful revelation had ultimately been an act of love, for my business, for myself, and even for the family who had dismissed me for so long. Success, I'd discovered, wasn't measured in lake house square footage or country club memberships. It was built in the courage to live truthfully, even when that truth disrupted comfortable illusions. As I looked around at the reconstructed relationships, more modest perhaps, but infinitely more real, I knew the boundaries had been worth every difficult conversation, every painful confrontation. Sometimes, I reflected, the greatest gift you can offer those lost in illusion is the opportunity to finally face reality. And sometimes, through that challenging gift, everyone ultimately finds their way to something better. He mocked my candle. Business while drinking whiskey I paid for. My in-laws had no idea that the hobby they ridiculed was worth millions, until the day I stopped paying their bills. The crystal champagne flute felt cool against my palm as I forced another smile. Through gritted teeth. Across the expansive dining table, my father-in-law Robert held court, gesturing with a tumbler of aged whiskey that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. "Another craft fair this weekend, Jessica?" he asked, his voice dripping, with the particular condescension he reserved for discussions of my business. "Remind me how many candles you need to sell to break even on your little hobby?" My mother-in-law Margaret tittered, the sound like fingernails on a chalkboard after 3 years of similar comments. She adjusted her freshly coiffed hair, the stylist bill for which had mysteriously appeared in my business account last month. "Now, Robert," she said with false kindness, "not everyone has your business acumen. Jessica enjoys her crafting, and that's what matters." I caught my husband Daniel's eye across the table, searching for any hint of the supportive partner I'd married. He offered a small shrug before returning his attention to the prime rib that graced his plate. Prime rib I had paid for, like everything else in this elaborate dinner at his parents' lakeside mansion in Minneapolis. If only they knew. If only they could see the irony that saturated every molecule of air in this dining room. The little candle hobby they'd dismissed for years had quietly grown into Luminous Home Goods, a company now valued at $8 million with distribution contracts spanning 3 states and a national retail deal freshly inked just yesterday. The craft fairs had been Phase 1, abandoned 2 years ago as we scaled into boutique wholesale, then regional distribution, and now the national market. But in this room, in this carefully maintained fiction, I remained the daughter-in-law with the cute little business that couldn't possibly generate serious income. "You know," Robert continued, swirling his whiskey, "my friend Thomas at first, Federal might be willing to look at a loan application for you, if you're finally ready to turn that hobby into something legitimate." I took a slow sip of champagne to hide my expression. First Federal had actually approached me last month about a potential investment partnership. Their board had been impressed by our growth metrics and sustainable manufacturing practices. I had declined. We were already self-funding our expansion from our substantial profits. "That's thoughtful, Robert," I replied, my voice carrying the practiced humility I'd perfected since marrying into the Wilson family. "I'll keep it in mind." Daniel cleared his throat. "Dad, Jessica's doing fine with her current approach. Not every business needs to scale the way yours did." It was the closest thing to support I'd heard from him in months, yet still couched in the fiction that Luminous was a modest enterprise rather than the economic engine currently funding this entire lifestyle. What the Wilsons didn't know, what Daniel had begged me to keep from them, was that Robert's much-vaunted financial empire had begun crumbling 2 years ago after a series of poorly timed investments. The same month his business began its downturn, Daniel had been quietly demoted at his investment firm, his salary slashed by 40%. Rather than adjust their expectations or lifestyle, Daniel had come to me with a temporary solution. We would help cover his parents' expenses until they recovered financially. My business was taking off, and the help would just be for a few months. A gesture of family support during a difficult time. Those few months had stretched into 2 years of escalating financial demands. Country club memberships maintained. European vacations funded. Private school tuition for Daniel's youngest sister covered without question. All while I sat through dinners like this one, enduring their mockery of the very business that kept them in aged whiskey and imported cheese. Jessica turned down a vendor at the Minneapolis spring market, Daniel offered, clearly hoping to change the subject. They didn't meet her quality standards. It was a strange half-truth. We had indeed declined a particular vendor, but not for a small market. They'd wanted to supply materials for our national product line, and their sustainability practices hadn't aligned with our company values. "Quality standards?" Robert chuckled, sharing a knowing look with Margaret. "For candles." Margaret reached over to pat my hand with practiced condescension. "It's good to have standards, dear, no matter how small the operation." I felt something shift within me, a tectonic plate moving after years of pressure. In my purse, my phone vibrated. Likely Natalie, my operations director, with updates on tomorrow's production meeting. Tomorrow, when we would finalize the rollout strategy for the biggest retail deal in our company's history. Tomorrow, when I would also begin implementing the exit strategy I'd been quietly assembling with my attorney over the past month. "Actually," I said, carefully placing my champagne flute on the table, "I turned down a materials supplier for our national retail line, the one launching next quarter at homestyle stores across the country." The table went silent. Daniel's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "I'm sorry," Margaret said with a confused laugh. "Did you say national retail line?" I met her gaze steadily. "Yes. Luminous products will be in 2,500 stores by the end of the quarter." Robert's expression shifted between confusion and disbelief. "Homestyle? The Homestyle chain?" "The same," I confirmed, a strange calm settling over me as 3 years of fiction began to disintegrate. "We signed the final contracts yesterday." Daniel was staring at me with something between panic and anger. "We had agreed to maintain the illusion until after his parents' anniversary trip next month, a trip they expected us to subsidize, like everything else." "Daniel," Robert said sharply, "what's Jessica talking about?" And there it was, the assumption that any significant business development in my life would have been communicated through my husband, reported to the family patriarch as procedure dictated. "Jessica's company has been growing," Daniel said carefully, his eyes pleading, with me to stop. "Jessica's company has been funding your lifestyle for 2 years, I corrected, my voice level. "Including the whiskey you're drinking, the vacation you're planning next month, and the country club dues you complained about last week." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret's perfectly manicured hand fluttered to her throat while Robert's face flushed a dangerous shade of red. "What exactly are you implying?" Robert finally managed, his voice dangerously soft. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts," I replied, sliding my phone across the table to display my documented transfers. "For 2 years, I've covered everything from gardening staff to private school tuition to credit card bills, all while sitting at this table listening to you mock the very business that pays for your champagne." Daniel stood abruptly. "Jessica, this isn't the time." "When would be the time, Daniel?" I asked, surprising myself with my composure. "After the anniversary trip I'm expected to fund? After the boat upgrade Robert mentioned last week? When exactly would be the appropriate time to discuss the $300,000 your parents have burned through while belittling me?" Margaret made a choked sound. 300? That's ridiculous. Daniel has been helping us through a temporary cash flow situation. A family matter. Daniel hasn't been in a position to help anyone since his demotion 2 years ago, I said, watching her perfectly composed facade crack further. His salary was cut by nearly half. The money has been coming from my little candle hobby all along. Robert pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I don't know what game you're playing, but my son would have told me if he'd lost status in your eyes," I finished quietly. "If he could no longer maintain the fiction of the successful son following in his father's footsteps? He was protecting your pride, Robert. And you've been spending my money while mocking my business acumen." Daniel's face had drained of all color. "Jessica, please." "No more," I said, rising from the table and gathering my purse. "As of today, the subsidies end. My company is expanding, and every dollar will be directed toward building our future, not maintaining your illusions. You have 2 choices. Adjust your lifestyle to match your actual income, or find someone else to fund your delusions of grandeur." I walked toward the door, each step feeling lighter than the last. Behind me, the accusations began. Daniel being berated for hiding their financial reality, Margaret's tearful protestations, Robert's blustering threats about family loyalty. I stepped into the cool evening air, breathing deeply for what felt like the first time in years. My phone buzzed again with Natalie's message about tomorrow's meetings. Tomorrow, when everything would change. Not just for Luminous Home Goods, but for me. The woman who had finally decided that success didn't need to hide itself in shadows to make others comfortable with their failures. The morning light streamed through the windows of my real office, not the modest spare bedroom the Wilsons had seen once and dismissed, but the converted warehouse in downtown Minneapolis that served as Luminous headquarters. Around me, the early shift of 30 employees prepared for the day, unaware that their CEO's personal life had imploded spectacularly the night before. "The production schedule looks solid," Natalie said, sliding a folder across my desk. My operations director had been with me since the beginning, when we mixed scents in my kitchen and hand-poured candles for our first craft fair. "But we need to discuss the cash flow projections." I nodded, opening the folder to review the numbers I'd already memorized. "The Wilson drain ends today. All resources redirect to expansion." Natalie's expression softened. "You finally told them?" "There wasn't a choice anymore," I replied, thinking of Daniel's frantic texts throughout the night. He'd stayed at his parents', presumably weathering the storm of their anger and disbelief. They were planning an anniversary vacation to the Maldives, another $50,000 at minimum. And Daniel. I stared at the production numbers, using their clean precision to anchor myself. He made his choice a long time ago. Last night just confirmed it. The truth was both simpler and more complex than I could articulate. For 3 years, I'd watched my husband transform from the supportive partner who'd encouraged my early business ambitions into someone I barely recognized, a man who prioritized his parents' approval over our financial security, who found it easier to spend my money than confront his family's unsustainable expectations. "Sharon called," Natalie said, referring to my attorney. She's finalized the documents you requested. Another piece clicking into place. I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, ever since discovering Daniel had secretly taken a loan against our house, my house, purchased before our marriage, to cover his parents' country club membership dues. I'll meet her at 2, I confirmed, turning to my calendar. After the production review and before the marketing meeting. The systematic dismantling of the financial entanglement would take time, but I'd laid the groundwork carefully. Separate accounts established, business protections implemented, exit strategy prepared if reconciliation proved impossible. My desk phone lit up. The front reception. "Mrs. Wilson is here to see you." For a moment, I thought it must be Margaret, coming to either apologize or berate me further. Then I remembered, I was Mrs. Wilson now, at least legally. The visitor was more likely. "Daniel's here," Natalie clarified, reading my expression. "Want me to send him away?" I considered the question, weighing the professional disruption against the inevitable confrontation. "No, send him up, but stay close." 5 minutes later, Daniel entered my office, his appearance shocking in its dishevelment. His normally immaculate suit was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his eyes red-rimmed from what appeared to be a sleepless night. "This is where you actually work," he said, taking in the expansive office with its view of the Minneapolis skyline. "I've never been here before." The statement hung between us, heavy with implication. 3 years of marriage, and he'd never visited the headquarters of my company. Never shown interest in seeing the operation that had grown from our spare bedroom to this. "What do you want, Daniel?" I asked, remaining seated behind my desk. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "My parents are devastated." Mom cried. "All night. Dad's talking about disowning me." No apology, I noted. No acknowledgement of the deception, the financial drain, the years of sitting silently while his parents belittled me. "That sounds difficult," I replied neutrally. "But it's the natural consequence of choices made over the past 2 years. You could have waited," he said, an edge of anger creeping into his voice. "We agreed to tell them after their anniversary, once Dad's new investment started paying off." "There is no new investment," I said quietly. "I had my financial advisor. Check. The venture Robert's been talking about doesn't exist. It's another fiction to maintain appearances." Daniel looked stricken. "That's not possible. He showed me the prospectus. Anyone can create a convincing-looking document," I replied. "But the company isn't registered with the SEC. It's vapor." He sank into one of the visitor chairs, the reality seemingly hitting him anew. "What am I supposed to do now? They're expecting me to fix this somehow." "What you do is your choice," I said, feeling a strange calm despite the turmoil. "But I can tell you what I'm doing. I'm meeting with our attorney this afternoon to ensure Luminous assets are protected. I'm redirecting all financial resources to our expansion. And I'm establishing clear boundaries about what I will and won't fund moving forward." "They're family," Daniel protested weakly. "Family doesn't mock you while spending your money," I countered. "Family doesn't demand you hide your success to protect their egos. And a husband doesn't allow his wife to be belittled at her own dinner table." The words hung between us, years of unspoken resentment finally finding voice. Daniel's shoulders slumped, the fight seeming to drain from him. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said softly. "It was supposed to be temporary, just until Dad's business recovered." "His business was never going to recover," I replied, just like he was never going to acknowledge my success. "These patterns were clear, Daniel. You just chose not to see them." Natalie appeared at the door, right on schedule. "Sorry to interrupt, but the production meeting starts in 5 minutes. I nodded my thanks. "We'll continue this discussion at home," I told Daniel, already gathering my materials for the meeting. "In the meantime, I suggest you think about what kind of future you want. One built on honesty and realistic expectations, or one maintaining expensive illusions until the money runs out. He looked lost, sitting in my corporate office, finally confronted with the reality of both his families, financial house of cards and my business success. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," he said as I reached the door. "Call their bluff like that." I paused, considering his choice of words. "That's the difference between us, Daniel. It wasn't a bluff. I meant every word." The rest of the day unfolded in a series of meetings and decisions, the rhythm of business providing structure amid personal chaos. The production team confirmed our capacity to meet the national rollout demands. The marketing presentation showcased our refreshed branding for the homestyle launch. Through it all, I remained focused, compartmentalizing the personal turmoil behind a wall of professional competence. At 2:00, I sat across from Sharon Blake in her downtown office, signing the documents that would protect Luminous from any potential fallout. These establish clear separation between personal and business finances, Sharon explained, her efficient tone reassuring. "And these protect your premarital assets, reinforcing the terms of your original agreement." I signed where indicated, each signature a decisive step toward the boundaries I should have established long ago. "And if reconciliation isn't possible?" I asked, giving voice to the question that had hovered in the background all day. Sharon's expression was compassionate but practical. "Then these documents form the foundation for a clean separation. But that's a decision for another day." I nodded, grateful for her pragmatism. Today was about establishing financial boundaries. The emotional boundaries, and their consequences, would follow in their own time. The house was dark when I arrived. Home that evening. No Daniel. No messages explaining his absence. Just the silence of our expansive suburban home. The home I'd purchased before our marriage. The home his name wasn't on, despite his recent attempt to borrow against it. I moved through the quiet rooms, shedding the armor of professional composure I'd maintained all day. In our bedroom, I noticed Daniel's side of the closet partially emptied, some essential items apparently packed in haste. Running to his parents, most likely, seeking comfort in familiar patterns rather than facing uncomfortable truths. My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. "Final production numbers confirmed. We're ready for this." At least in my professional life, things moved forward with purpose and clarity. The national launch would proceed as planned. Luminous would grow according to our carefully calibrated strategy. The business I'd built from my kitchen table would take its place on national retail shelves. And my personal life? That remained. A question mark, its answer dependent on choices yet to be made, by Daniel, by his parents, and by me. I poured a glass of wine and settled onto the patio, watching the sunset paint the Minneapolis skyline in shades of amber and gold. Whatever happened next, I had reclaimed something essential: the truth of my success, the value of my work, and the power to define my own boundaries. The Wilsons had demanded I cover their luxury lifestyle after my business success. But the financial boundaries I'd finally set would change everything. For them, for Daniel, and most importantly, for me. 3 days passed with minimal contact from Daniel beyond terse texts confirming he was staying with his parents. 3 days of focusing on Luminous while the personal situation simmered in the background. On the 4th morning, my assistant interrupted a supplier meeting. "Mrs. Wilson is here to see you," she said quietly. "Daniel?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "No, his mother." The conference room fell silent. My team knew nothing about my personal situation, but they'd all met my mother-in-law at the company holiday party last year, where she'd commented loudly about cute little businesses while drinking top-shelf champagne my company had provided. "Give me 5 minutes to wrap up," I told my assistant, turning back to the supplier negotiations with renewed focus. Exactly 5 minutes later, I walked into my office to find Margaret Wilson perched uncomfortably on the edge of a visitor chair. Her appearance was noticeably different from her usual polished perfection. Her designer outfit still impeccable, but her expression strained, the confident posture replaced by something more hesitant. "Thank you for seeing me," she said formally, as though we were business acquaintances rather than family. "Of course," I replied, taking my seat behind the desk. "How can I help you?" Margaret glanced around the office, taking in the awards on the wall, the product prototypes displayed on shelves, the view of downtown Minneapolis. I could see her mentally recalibrating, adjusting her understanding of my business from craft hobby to substantial enterprise. "Your office is impressive," she finally said. "Thank you." An uncomfortable silence stretched between us. I waited, allowing her to find her way to the purpose of this unprecedented visit. "Robert had a meeting with our financial advisor. Yesterday," she finally continued, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. "It was illuminating." I remained silent, suspecting where this might be heading but unwilling to ease her path. "It appears," she continued, her voice strained, "that our financial situation is not what we believed. There have been miscalculations." "Miscalculations," I repeated neutrally. "Significant ones." Margaret looked down at her perfectly manicured hands. "The advisor confirmed what you said at dinner, about the extent of assistance your company has provided." I nodded, acknowledging her statement without offering absolution. "Daniel has explained some things," she continued, visibly struggling, "about his position at the firm, about how Luminous has grown." She gestured to encompass the office. "Clearly, we've been uninformed about certain realities." The careful wording, uninformed rather than dismissive or condescending, was so characteristic of Margaret's approach to uncomfortable truths. "I appreciate that acknowledgement," I said carefully, "but I'm curious about the purpose of your visit today." Margaret straightened, some of her usual composure returning. "We need to discuss arrangements moving forward. The anniversary trip to the Maldives, the country club membership renewal, Claire's tuition for next semester." She named Daniel's younger sister, still in private university. "Given the circumstances, we'll need to adjust the contribution schedule." I stared at her, momentarily speechless. After everything, the revelations, the confrontation, Daniel's hasty retreat to his parents' home, she had come to negotiate continued financial support. "Let me be sure I understand," I said slowly. "You're here to discuss how my company will continue subsidizing your lifestyle just with an adjusted schedule?" Margaret looked startled by my directness. "Well, family supports family, Jessica. Obviously, some adjustments are necessary given recent disclosures, but surely we can reach a reasonable arrangement." "There will be no arrangement," I said, my voice level but firm. "As I stated at dinner, the subsidies have ended. Completely. But Claire's tuition is not my responsibility," I finished. "Nor are your vacations, memberships, or any other expenses. Your financial reality requires adjusting your expenditures to match your actual income, not finding a new source of funding." Margaret's expression hardened. "This vindictiveness is beneath you, Jessica. We've always welcomed you into our family, despite your unconventional background." My unconventional background, Margaret's euphemism for my middle-class upbringing, so different from the Wilson family's generations of wealth and privilege, or what had appeared to be wealth and privilege before the facade began crumbling. "This isn't about vindictiveness," I replied calmly. "It's about healthy boundaries. Luminous is a growing company with employees who depend on sound financial management. Our resources will be directed toward sustainable growth, not unsustainable personal spending." "Daniel said you might be difficult about this," Margaret said, reaching for her purse. "Robert thought we might need this." She withdrew, a folded document, and placed it on my desk. I recognized it immediately, a copy of our prenuptial agreement. Your marriage includes certain obligations, she continued, her tone hardening. Financial support is an understood component of being a Wilson. This document doesn't preclude family support. I almost laughed at the irony. The prenuptial agreement had been Robert's idea, designed to protect the Wilson family assets from being claimed by me in the event of a divorce. Daniel had presented it apologetically, explaining it as a standard family practice. I had signed willingly, confident in my ability to build my own security. You might want to review that document more carefully, I suggested, not touching the paper. Particularly the clauses about separate property and business assets. My attorney certainly has. Margaret's confident expression faltered. The prenup you're attempting to use as leverage, I continued, actually protects my business and premarital assets from Wilson family claims. It was written to protect you from me, but it works equally well in reverse. This isn't how family behaves, Margaret protested, her composure cracking further. I agree, I replied simply. Family doesn't belittle each other's achievements while secretly depending on them. Family doesn't pressure members to maintain financially ruinous situations, to preserve appearances. Family doesn't mock someone's life's work while drinking champagne purchased with profits from that same work. Margaret stood abruptly, gathering her purse with trembling hands. Robert was right. You never understood our values. I understood them perfectly, I countered, rising as well. Appearance over reality, image over truth, pride over honesty. I simply don't share them. Daniel will need to make some difficult choices, she said, a veiled threat in her tone. Yes, I agreed quietly. He will. After she left, I remained standing by my desk, processing the encounter. Margaret's visit had clarified something essential. The Wilson family wasn't simply adjusting to financial reality. They were actively seeking to maintain their illusions by any means necessary, which meant the boundaries I'd established would be tested repeatedly before being accepted. And Daniel would indeed face the difficult choice between his family's expectations and our marriage's reality. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, the final review for the homestyle launch materials, followed by media training for the upcoming press tour. Life continued moving forward, regardless of personal turmoil. As I gathered my materials for the meeting, I felt a strange sense of clarity. For 3 years, I'd contorted myself to fit the Wilsons' narrative. The indulged wife with her cute hobby, the daughter-in-law who should be grateful for their social connections, the outsider who couldn't possibly understand how things work in our circles. That contortion had ended. Whatever came next, reconciliation or separation, understanding or continued conflict, would happen on the level ground of truth rather than the shifting sands of pretense. The financial boundaries I'd set were just the beginning. The real change would come from the honesty those boundaries now demanded from everyone involved, including me. 1 week after Margaret's office visit, I sat in Sharon Blake's law office reviewing the latest financial documentation. The glossy conference table reflected the Minneapolis skyline as Sharon methodically walked me through the protective measures we'd implemented. All company assets are now fully secured, she confirmed, tapping a manicured nail against the legal documents. The business operating agreement has been updated to include additional safeguards against any potential claims. I nodded, feeling the weight of necessary precaution rather than victory. The past week had unfolded in a series of uncomfortable revelations, financial, emotional, and familial. And the house? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The loan attempt has been formally disputed, Sharon replied. The mortgage company acknowledges that Daniel had no legal right to use the property as collateral without your signature. They're unwinding the transaction. Another necessary step, another boundary established. The discovery that Daniel had attempted to secure a $75,000 loan against my premarital property, my house, had been the catalyst for this meeting. The loan had been intended to cover Robert's investment losses, Yet another attempt to maintain the Wilson family's facade of prosperity. "Have you heard from Daniel today?" Sharon asked, her professional demeanor softening slightly. She'd been handling my legal affairs since Luminous was nothing more than a business plan and a dream. "He's coming home tonight," I replied, still uncertain how I felt about this development. "After 10 days at his parents', he says he's ready to talk." Sharon nodded, carefully neutral. "And you? Are you ready?" I considered the question, allowing myself to acknowledge the complicated emotions that had been overshadowed by logistics and legal precautions. "I'm ready for honesty," I finally said. "Whether that leads to reconciliation or separation remains to be seen." The afternoon sun cast long shadows as I pulled into our driveway. Daniel's car was already there, a luxury model leased through my company, though his parents believed he'd purchased it with his banking bonus. One more fiction in a relationship that had accumulated them like dust. He was sitting in the kitchen, a space I'd renovated before our marriage with the first significant profits from Luminous. His appearance had improved since our last encounter, properly dressed, recently shaven, but his expression remained troubled, his posture tense. "Thank you for coming home," I said simply, setting my briefcase on the counter. No accusations, no demands. Just acknowledgement of his presence after a 10-day absence. "It's still my home too," he replied, a defensive edge in his voice. I nodded, remaining standing. "Yes, it is. For now." The qualification hung between us, impossible to ignore. Everything was, for now. Our marriage, our living arrangement, our future. All contingent on conversations yet to unfold. "I've spent the week talking with my parents," Daniel began, his hands clasped tightly on the kitchen table, "and meeting with their financial advisor, and ours." A small acknowledgement that he recognized the separation of finances already underway. "The situation is complicated." "The situation is actually quite simple," I countered, finally taking a seat across from him. "Your parents have been living beyond their means for years. Your father's business has been failing for longer than you've acknowledged. And rather than face reality, everyone chose deception." Daniel flinched at the directness, but didn't argue. Progress of a sort. "Dad always taught me that appearance matters," he said quietly. "That confidence inspires confidence, that showing weakness means inviting failure." And that philosophy led to this moment, I observed, where the appearance of success became more important than actual success. He nodded, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it caused an unexpected pang. This was the man I'd fallen in love with, somewhere beneath the layers of family expectations and financial deception. "Mom showed me the budget," he continued, a hint of shock still evident in his voice. "The real one, not the one they present." To their friends. "They've been operating at a deficit for nearly 5 years. Dad's investment losses, the house maintenance, Claire's tuition." He shook his head. "They're underwater by almost 7 figures. The amount didn't surprise me. Between their lakeside mansion, the European vacations, the country club membership, and their determination to maintain the appearance of prosperity, the Wilsons had been burning money faster than Robert's failing business could possibly generate it." "And their plan moving forward?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Daniel looked up, his expression pained. "That's what I need to discuss with you. They've put together a proposal for a family loan, structured with interest, for a 3-year term." I waited, giving him space to continue. "They've already started making changes," he added quickly. "Dad's putting the boat up for sale. They're considering downsizing from the lake house. Mom's talking to Claire about transferring to a state school to save on tuition." "Considering," I noted. "Talking about, not actually doing." Daniel sighed. "These things take time, Jessica. They're adjusting to a new reality." "A reality that has been true for years," I pointed out. They're not adjusting to new circumstances. They're finally acknowledging existing ones. Can you blame them for needing time? He asked, a flash of his parents' defensiveness showing through. Their entire world is changing. What I blame them for, I replied evenly, is expecting others to fund their denial, including you, including me. Daniel was quiet for a moment, absorbing the truth of this statement. The loan would be different, he finally said. Structured. Properly, with their house as collateral. Not open-ended like before. I studied my husband, seeing with new clarity the conflict within him. He was trying to find middle ground between his parents' expectations and my boundaries, trying to preserve both relationships without forcing a final choice. I can't offer what doesn't exist, I said gently. Luminous is expanding. Every dollar of profit is allocated to growth. There is no surplus for personal loans, regardless of terms. But you're making millions? He protested, frustration breaking through. Surely there's something available, even temporarily. And there it was. The fundamental misunderstanding that had haunted our marriage. The belief that my success equated to available cash for family use. The inability to see Luminous as a separate entity with its own needs and trajectory. Business valuation isn't the same as available cash, I explained, though we'd had this conversation before. Yes, Luminous is projected to be worth 8 figures after the national rollout. That doesn't mean those funds are sitting in an account for personal distribution. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. So you're refusing, after everything they've done for us? The question momentarily stunned me. What exactly have they done for us, Daniel? Besides mock my business while secretly benefiting from it? Besides forcing you to hide your career setbacks? Besides creating a culture of financial deception that's nearly destroyed our marriage? He had the grace to look ashamed. They gave us connections, social standing. They welcomed you into the family. They tolerated me, I corrected, while making it clear I would never quite belong in their circles. And they've spent 3 years undermining my confidence while depending on my success. We sat in silence as the afternoon light faded, each lost in private thoughts. Outside the kitchen window, a neighbor walked their dog. Their ordinary evening, routine continuing regardless of the life-altering conversation unfolding in our home. I don't know how to fix this, Daniel finally admitted, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. It's not about fixing, I replied. It's about changing. Your parents need to change their lifestyle to match their actual resources. You need to change your relationship with them to stop enabling financial fiction. And I need to change how I engage with both situations. And us? He asked, finally looking directly at me. What changes for us? I considered the question carefully, unwilling to offer false hope or premature conclusions. That depends on whether you're ready for honesty, I said finally. Real honesty, not just acknowledging what can no longer be denied. About your career aspirations. About your relationship with your parents. About what kind of partnership you actually want. Daniel nodded slowly. And if I am? Ready for honesty, I mean. Then we start there, I replied simply. With truth as the foundation, whatever we build, whether reconciliation or an amicable separation, will at least be stable. As darkness fell outside, we continued talking, more openly than we had in years. Daniel revealed his growing dissatisfaction with banking, a career chosen primarily to please his father. I shared my plans for Luminous, the vision that had driven me even when hiding it from his family. We didn't couldn't resolve everything in one conversation, but we established a tentative framework for moving forward. Daniel would stay in the guest room while we navigated this new territory. We would engage a financial counselor to create complete transparency around our personal resources. And most importantly, we would maintain firm boundaries with the Wilsons while they adjusted to their new economic reality. When we finally turned in for the night, exhaustion replaced anger as the dominant emotion. Whether our marriage would survive remained an open question, but at least now it was an honest question rather than one buried beneath layers of deception and denial. Morning brought a renewed sense of purpose as I prepared for a critical day at Luminous. The homestyle launch was 2 weeks away, with final production decisions needed immediately. As I gathered my materials, Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed for his first day back at the office after his self-imposed exile. "I called Dad last night," he said, accepting the coffee I offered. "Told him there would be no loan, structured or otherwise, that they need to accelerate their downsizing plans." I nodded, acknowledging both the difficulty and necessity of this boundary. "How did he take it?" "About as well as expected," Daniel replied with a grimace. Anger, then bargaining, then thinly veiled threats about my place in the family. But it's done. The simple statement carried significant weight. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, Daniel had chosen clarity over comfort, reality over the Wilson family mythology. It was a single step on a longer journey, but an essential one. "Thank you," I said simply. "I know that wasn't easy." He nodded, his expression somber but resolved. "I also called a career counselor. I've been phoning it in at the bank for years. Maybe it's time to figure out what I actually want to do, not what Dad planned for me." Another step. Small, tentative, but genuine. As we prepared to leave for our respective offices, an unexpected knock at the door interrupted the morning routine. Daniel opened it to reveal Robert Wilson, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, his luxury sedan parked in our driveway. "We need to talk," Robert announced, brushing past Daniel into the foyer. He stopped short upon seeing me, clearly having expected to find his son alone. "Jessica, I thought you'd be at your shop." Even now, he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge Luminous as a real business. Some patterns ran too deep for circumstances to immediately change them. "I was just leaving for the office," I replied evenly. "But since you're here, perhaps we should all talk." Robert's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly, following us into the kitchen. He declined the offered coffee, standing rather than sitting, a power move I recognized from countless Wilson family gatherings. Always position yourself higher than those you wish to influence. "Daniel's call last night was unacceptable," he began without preamble. "The family is facing a temporary situation that requires a unified response. His refusal to participate is—" He searched for the right word. "Disappointing." Daniel tensed beside me but held his ground. "The situation isn't temporary, Dad. It's been building for years. And my refusal isn't about loyalty. It's about reality." Robert's expression hardened. "I built a business that supported this family for 30 years. That paid for your education, your opportunities, your connections. When that business faces challenges, family steps up." "Your business has been failing for nearly a decade," I interjected, unwilling to let the revisionist history stand. "You've been supplementing with increasingly risky investments, covering losses with new debt, and eventually relying on funds from Luminous, funneled through Daniel, to maintain appearances." Robert's face flushed with anger. "This is a family matter. If my son wants to help his parents through a difficult time, that's his decision." "Except it wasn't just his decision," I replied calmly. "It was my company's revenue being diverted without full disclosure. And it wasn't helping through a difficult time. It was enabling a fiction that's become increasingly expensive to maintain." Daniel stepped forward, physically positioning himself between his father and me. A small gesture, but significant in its symbolism. "Jessica's right, Dad," he said firmly. "This isn't a temporary cash flow issue. It's a fundamental mismatch between your lifestyle and your actual resources. And continuing to fund it doesn't help anyone." Robert's expression shifted from anger to something closer to desperation. an emotion I'd never seen on his carefully composed face. "Your mother is devastated," he said, his voice lower. "The thought of selling the lake house, of telling our friends we can't renew the country club membership. Do you have any idea what that will do to her? To our standing in the community?" And there it was, the core of the Wilson family philosophy: appearance above all, social standing as the ultimate currency. The unquestioned belief that how others perceived you mattered more than the reality behind the facade. "I understand. It will be difficult," Daniel acknowledged, his tone gentler but his position unchanged. "But continuing as before isn't an option. The resources simply don't exist." "Because she won't allow it," Robert snapped, gesturing toward me. "Luminous could easily provide a bridge loan while my investments mature." I shook my head, recognizing the language of addiction in his phrasing. "Just one more loan. Just until things turn around. Just a little longer to maintain the facade." "Luminous is a separate entity with its own financial responsibilities," I explained, maintaining professional composure, "including obligations to employees, vendors, and growth initiatives. It's not a personal piggy bank, regardless of family connections." Robert's gaze hardened as he looked at me. "You've never understood our world, Jessica. Never appreciated the importance of certain standards. Now you're using this situation to drive a wedge between my son and his family." The accusation was so backward, so completely inverted from reality, that I almost laughed. For 3 years, I'd contorted myself to fit their expectations, hidden my success to protect their egos, and watched silently as they belittled my achievements while benefiting from them. "Dad," Daniel said sharply, "that's enough. Jessica isn't the problem here. The problem is that we've all been living in a fantasy, me included. A fantasy about your financial stability, about my career satisfaction, about what success actually looks like." Robert seemed genuinely shocked by his son's response. Perhaps for the first time, he was seeing Daniel as an independent adult rather than an extension of himself. "We've prepared some resources," I said into the uncomfortable silence, retrieving a folder from my briefcase. "Contact information for financial counselors specializing in retirement transitions. A realtor experienced in luxury properties who can help you right-size to something more manageable. And literature on investment strategies appropriate for your actual situation." Robert stared at the folder as though it might bite him. "You think a few pamphlets will solve decades of financial planning?" "Nothing will solve it except facing reality," Daniel replied firmly. "These are tools to help with that process, not magical solutions." Robert didn't take the folder, his pride still too wounded to accept assistance that acknowledged the truth of his circumstances. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, gathering the remnants of his dignity. "Your mother will be heartbroken," he said to Daniel, his final attempt at emotional leverage. "Probably," Daniel acknowledged, "but she'll heal, and eventually, she might appreciate living without the constant pressure of maintaining appearances beyond your means." Robert left. Shortly after, his departure marked by stiff formality rather than the warm embraces that typically ended Wilson family interactions. The door closed behind him with a quiet finality that suggested a threshold had been crossed. Daniel and I stood in the foyer, processing the encounter that had just ended and the journey still ahead. "That's the first time I've ever truly stood up to him," Daniel said quietly, wonder mixing with grief in his voice. I reached for his hand, a small gesture of solidarity. "It's probably not the last difficult conversation." He nodded, squeezing my hand briefly before releasing it. "One step at a time, right?" "One step at a time," I agreed. As we headed to our separate vehicles, I realized that the financial boundaries I'd finally established weren't just about money. They were creating space for something new to grow: honesty, self-awareness, and perhaps a more authentic relationship with both ourselves and each other. Whether our marriage would survive remained uncertain, but whatever emerged from this period of painful truth would at least be built on reality rather than comforting fictions. And that, I reflected as I drove toward the luminous offices, was a foundation worth building upon. The next 3 weeks unfolded in a rhythm of professional advancement and personal recalibration. At Luminous, the homestyle launch proceeded with precision. Product shipped to distribution centers, marketing materials finalized, press appearances scheduled. My days were filled with the exhilarating rush of seeing years of work culminate in national recognition. At home, Daniel and I navigated a new landscape of cautious honesty. He remained in the guest room, our physical separation mirroring the emotional space we needed to evaluate our path forward. Our conversations grew increasingly authentic, touching on subjects long avoided. His dissatisfaction with banking, my resentment at hiding my success, our different visions of what partnership meant. The Wilson family situation evolved with painful slowness. Robert and Margaret had reluctantly listed their lakeside mansion, though the asking price reflected wishful thinking rather than market reality. They'd begun the process of resigning from the country club, a social extraction Margaret described in hushed tones as absolutely mortifying. Claire had transferred to the state university for her final year, a practical decision that came with much dramatic sighing about adjusting expectations. Through it all, I maintained the financial boundaries that had triggered this cascade of changes. No loans, no subsidies, no quiet transfers to ease the transition. Each time the subject arose, and it did, with decreasing frequency but persistent hope, the answer remained consistent and firm. 26 days after that pivotal dinner, I stood in the gleaming aisles of Homestyle's flagship Minneapolis store, watching as customers browsed the luminous display. Our candles, diffusers, and home textiles occupied prime retail space, the packaging I'd agonized over drawing appreciative attention from shoppers. "Congratulations," said a familiar voice behind me. I turned to find Margaret Wilson standing uncertainly among the shopping carts and browser baskets. Her appearance had changed subtly, still elegantly dressed, but in clothing that suggested careful selection rather than careless expense. The designer handbag was gone, replaced by something more modest. "Thank you," I replied, genuine surprise temporarily displacing the wariness I'd come to associate with Wilson family interactions. "I didn't expect to see you here." Margaret adjusted her scarf, a nervous gesture I'd rarely observed in her typically composed demeanor. "Claire told me about the launch, said I should—" She hesitated. "Said I should see what you've built." I nodded, allowing the awkward moment to exist without rushing to fill it. Margaret Wilson had never shown interest in my business beyond its potential reflection on the family image. This tentative step represented something new. "It's quite impressive," she continued, gesturing toward the luminous display. "The packaging is elegant." Coming from Margaret, whose aesthetic judgments were typically delivered as thinly veiled criticisms, this constituted high praise. "Would you like to see the full collection?" I offered, extending a small olive branch. She nodded, following me through the display as I explained the product lines, the ethical sourcing practices, the manufacturing partnerships we'd developed across 3 states. As we talked, I noticed her asking genuine questions, her customary dismissiveness replaced by something closer to respect. "I had no idea," she said finally, holding one of our signature candles, "about any of this. The scale, the thought behind it, She gestured vaguely. "The realness of it." "You never asked," I pointed out, not unkindly. "In 3 years, you never once asked about the business beyond how many craft fairs I'd attended." Margaret had the grace to look embarrassed. "I assumed it was just a hobby. Something to keep you occupied while Daniel built his career." "I know," I replied simply. That was the problem. We stood in awkward silence among the bustling shoppers, 3 years of misunderstandings and dismissals hanging between us. "We've found a buyer for the house," Margaret finally said, changing the subject. "Not at our asking price, but acceptable. We close next month." I nodded, acknowledging both the practical update and the emotional weight behind it. "That seems like a positive step." "Robert is struggling," she admitted, surprising me with her frankness. "His identity was so tied to certain appearances. Letting go of them feels like failure to him." "There's a difference between failure and recalibration," I offered. "Between losing everything and right-sizing to reality." Margaret considered this, turning the candle in her hands. "I spoke with the financial counselor, the one from the folder you gave Robert. He said something similar." She paused. "He also said we could have avoided much of this if we'd been honest about our situation years ago." Another step toward reality, however hesitant. "Daniel seems different," she continued. "More settled somehow, despite everything." "He's exploring what he actually wants," I explained, "not what was expected of him. It's challenging, but there's freedom in it too." Margaret replaced the candle on the display, her movements careful and deliberate. "I always thought I was protecting my children by giving them the best of everything. The right schools, the right connections, the right appearances. Now I wonder if I was just limiting them instead." The admission carried more weight than any apology could have. It represented a fundamental questioning of the values that had guided the Wilson family for generations. "It's never too late to reassess," I said gently. "To ask yourself what actually matters versus what just looks important." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I should go. I just wanted to understand a little better." As she turned to leave, she paused, looking back at the luminous display. "You've built something remarkable, Jessica. Something real. I'm sorry I couldn't see that before." The simple acknowledgement, delivered without qualifications or undercutting, felt more significant than any grand gesture could have. It represented the first genuine recognition from the Wilson family of who I actually was, not who they'd assumed or wished me to be. That evening, I recounted the encounter to Daniel as we prepared dinner in our kitchen, a shared meal that had become part of our tentative new routine. "Mom came to the store?" he repeated, clearly surprised. "Voluntarily?" I nodded, slicing vegetables for the salad. She even complimented the packaging design, without adding, "considering what you had to work with," or some similar qualifier. Daniel shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Small miracles." "How was your meeting with the career counselor?" I asked, changing the subject to his own journey of recalibration. His expression brightened. "Illuminating. We've identified a few paths that actually align with my interests rather than Dad's expectations. Including," he hesitated, "potentially teaching business ethics at the university level." I paused in my preparation, genuinely surprised by this direction. "Teaching? That's unexpected." "For the son Robert Wilson raised?" "Absolutely," he agreed with a self-deprecating laugh. "But maybe not for who I actually am. The parts of banking I enjoyed were always mentoring junior associates, explaining complex concepts, helping people understand systems." I considered. This revelation, seeing threads of authentic interest I'd glimpsed throughout our relationship but never fully recognized. "That makes a lot of sense, actually." Daniel nodded, his expression more animated than I'd seen in months. "I've applied for an adjunct position teaching one course next semester. A way to test the waters while maintaining income from the bank. A practical approach, but also a meaningful step toward authenticity." "I'm happy for you," I said simply, meaning it. As we sat down to dinner, the conversation turned to logistics: the Wilsons' house sale, Claire's adjustment to State University, the ongoing separation of our finances from theirs. But beneath these practical matters ran a current of something more fundamental, a reassessment of values, of priorities, of what constituted success. "I keep thinking about something you said," Daniel reflected as we finished our meal. "About how setting boundaries isn't about punishment. It's about creating space for something healthier to grow." I nodded, remembering the conversation from our early days of renegotiating our relationship. "The financial boundaries you set," he continued thoughtfully, "they're changing everything. Not just our bank accounts or my parents' lifestyle, but how we see ourselves, what we value, who we're trying to be." The observation carried the weight of genuine insight rather than defensive justification. Daniel was seeing, perhaps for the first time, how the pursuit of appearances had constrained everyone involved: him, his parents, our marriage, even me. Financial boundaries were just the beginning, I acknowledged. They made other boundaries possible: emotional ones, expectational ones, identity ones. Daniel reached across the table, a tentative gesture of connection. "Thank you for having the courage to set them, even when I couldn't." I took his offered hand, feeling the first genuine hope for our future that I'd experienced in months. We weren't fixed, might never fully repair certain fractures, but we were at least facing the same direction, looking toward truth rather than comfortable illusion. The financial boundaries I'd set had indeed changed everything. Not by destroying what existed before, but by creating space for something authentic to finally emerge from beneath the crushing weight of appearances, expectations, and illusions that had kept us all from seeing who we really were and who we might yet become. 2 months after the homestyle launch, I stood at the podium in Luminous Headquarters' newly renovated conference room, addressing our expanded team of 50 employees. The quarterly numbers displayed on the screen behind me exceeded even our most optimistic projections. National distribution had transformed our business trajectory, propelling us from regional success to industry recognition. "These results reflect your dedication and vision," I told the assembled team, genuine pride warming my voice. Every person in this room contributed to this milestone. Natalie stood at the back, giving me a discreet thumbs up. As my operations director and closest confidant, she'd weathered every phase of Luminous's growth, from kitchen table experiments to our current multi-state operation. She'd also provided unwavering support through the personal turbulence of recent months, never once questioning my ability to lead despite the emotional challenges. "As we move into the next quarter," I continued, "we'll be implementing the expansion initiatives outlined in your packets. New product lines, additional manufacturing partnerships, and a West Coast distribution center to improve delivery times." The energy in the room was palpable, the collective excitement of a team that had helped build something meaningful and watched it succeed. This was the reality I'd kept hidden from the Wilsons for years, the accomplishment they'd dismissed as a hobby while secretly depending on its success. After fielding questions and acknowledging individual contributions, I returned to my office to find a vase of sunflowers on my desk, my favorite, though few people knew this. The card carried Daniel's handwriting. "Congratulations on the quarterly results. Proud of you. Dinner tonight to celebrate?" The simple gesture represented something significant. Throughout our marriage, Daniel had acknowledged my business milestones, with polite interest but never genuine enthusiasm. His congratulations had always been tempered with qualifiers: impressive for a new company, or doing well in that market segment. Subtle diminishments that echoed his parents' perspective. These sunflowers, this note, carried no qualifiers. Just straightforward pride and a desire to celebrate. Another small indicator of the changes unfolding in our relationship. I texted my acceptance of the dinner invitation, then turned to the stack of correspondence on my desk. Among the business mail sat a cream-colored envelope bearing the distinctive Wilson family monogram, Margaret's preferred stationery for personal communications. Inside was a formal invitation to Claire's graduation ceremony at the State University, accompanied by a handwritten note. "We would be honored if you would attend," Margaret had written. "Claire specifically asked for you to be there. Your support during this transition has meant more than she initially acknowledged." The invitation represented another shift in the family dynamic. 3 months ago, such an event would have been orchestrated as a Wilson family showcase. Private dinner reservations at an exclusive restaurant, references to Robert's connections with university trustees, subtle reminders of their social position. Now the celebration would necessarily be more modest, aligned with their adjusted circumstances. More significant than the practical adjustments was the tone of Margaret's note. No hint of resentment or forced politeness, just a straightforward acknowledgement of appreciation, particularly from Claire, who had initially blamed me for ruining everything when forced to transfer from her private university. I added the ceremony to my calendar, then returned to quarterly projections and expansion planning. The afternoon passed in productive focus, the rhythm of business providing a steadying counterpoint to the still evolving personal situation. That evening, Daniel and I met at Osteria Verde, a neighborhood restaurant we'd frequented early in our relationship, but had eventually abandoned in favor of the expensive establishments the Wilsons preferred. The familiar warmth of the space felt like rediscovering something valuable we'd misplaced. Daniel was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, his typical banking attire replaced by casual clothes. Another subtle shift, dressing for comfort rather than impression, no longer feeling obligated to maintain the Wilson family image at all times. "The business professor emerges," I noted with a smile, gesturing to his relaxed appearance. He returned the smile, more freely than he had in years. "I finished my first week as an adjunct, 3 sessions of Business Ethics 101, and somehow the classroom is still standing." "How does it feel?" I asked, genuinely curious about this new direction. Daniel considered the question thoughtfully. "Terrifying, exhilarating, more authentic than anything I've done in years." He paused. "I keep waiting for my father's voice in my head to start listing all the reasons teaching is beneath a Wilson, but it's getting quieter." We ordered a modest bottle of wine, good quality but not extravagant, another adjustment from the days when Daniel would insist on the most expensive option to maintain appearances. As we settled into conversation, I found myself studying his expression, noting the gradual relaxation of tension that had been his constant companion for years. "I saw Claire yesterday," he mentioned as our entrees arrived. "She's coming to terms with the university transfer. Actually said the environmental science program is stronger than at Westfield Academy." "That's significant progress," I observed. Claire had been among the most resistant to the Wilson family's necessary downsizing, having absorbed her parents' emphasis on prestigious connections and appearances. Daniel nodded. "She's also applying for an actual job, part-time at a conservation nonprofit. Said she wants to contribute to her expenses rather than just—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Rather than just expecting others to cover everything?" I suggested gently. "Exactly." He looked almost bemused. I barely recognized her. She's never worked a day in her life before. None of us had to. The observation revealed layers of recognition about the Wilson family privilege, the unquestioned expectation that life would arrange itself to their specifications without effort on their part, that others would make accommodations, financial and otherwise, to maintain their comfort and status. "How are your parents adjusting to the new house?" I asked, steering toward the practical changes underway. The Wilsons had finally sold their lakeside mansion, though at significantly less than their initial asking price. They'd purchased a comfortable but modest condominium in a respectable neighborhood, downsizing from 8,000 square feet to 2,200, from lakefront luxury to practical comfort. "Mom's actually embracing it," Daniel replied, surprising me. "Says maintaining the mansion was exhausting. She's joined a community garden program in their neighborhood." He shook his head in lingering disbelief. "Margaret Wilson, digging in. Actual dirt, voluntarily. And Robert? I asked, knowing his adjustment would be more challenging. Daniel's expression sobered. Struggling. His identity was so tied to that house, that address, that lifestyle. The financial advisor has him on a strict budget for the first time in his adult life. He finds it demeaning. I nodded, understanding without approving. Robert. Wilson had spent decades defining success through acquisition and display, through the envy his possessions generated in others. Learning to measure life by different metrics would require a fundamental rewiring of his perspectives. He asked about you, Daniel added carefully, watching my reaction. Wanted to know how the business was doing after the launch. A small but noteworthy shift. Previously, Robert had avoided any acknowledgement of Luminous as a legitimate enterprise, referring to it obliquely as Jessica's project, or the candle thing. And what did you tell him? I asked. The truth, Daniel replied simply. That the national rollout exceeded projections, that you're expanding operations and hiring additional staff, that you've been recognized in Trade Monthly as an emerging leader in the home goods sector. I absorbed this information, trying to discern whether Robert's inquiry represented genuine interest or merely seeking evidence that the financial resource he'd lost access to continued to flourish without benefiting him. Has he mentioned financial assistance recently? I asked directly. Daniel shook his head. Not since the house sale closed. The proceeds cleared their immediate debts and created a modest cushion. The financial advisor has them on a sustainability plan. He hesitated. I think they're finally accepting the new reality. Not happily, but necessarily. The meal continued. With lighter conversation, Daniel's teaching experiences, the upcoming product line Luminous would launch for the holiday season, Claire's graduation plans. As we shared dessert, I realized we were having the most relaxed, authentic interaction we'd experienced in years. Without the pressure of maintaining appearances or the weight of financial deception, we were rediscovering elements of the connection that had initially drawn us together. I've been meaning to ask, Daniel said as we finished our coffee, about the house. Our home situation remained in transition. Daniel had continued to occupy the guest room, our physical separation mirroring the emotional space still being navigated. The mortgage paperwork had been updated to prevent any further unauthorized loan attempts, with additional legal protections implemented through Sharon's meticulous planning. What about it? I asked, unsure of his direction. I've been looking at apartments, he replied, watching my reaction carefully. Nothing permanent, just month to month. I thought it might give us both some additional space to figure things out. The statement hung between us, not an announcement of permanent separation, but an acknowledgement that our reconciliation remained tentative, the trust between us still fragile and rebuilding. If that's what you need, I said carefully, I understand. Daniel reached across the table, taking my hand in a gentle gesture. It's not about what I need. It's about respecting where we are. We're making progress, but pretending everything is fixed overnight would be another form of deception. The insight reflected the personal growth he'd undertaken in recent months, a willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths rather than papering over them with convenient fiction. When would you move? I asked, processing the implications of this development. Next week, if that seems reasonable, he replied. It's a 3-month lease. Time to continue the conversations we're having, but with enough separation to ensure they're authentic rather than convenient. I nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in his suggestion despite the emotional complexity it created. I think you're right. We need to rebuild with intention, not proximity. As we left the restaurant, walking toward our cars in the mild evening air, Daniel stopped suddenly. I need you to know something, he said, his expression earnest. Regardless of where we land, whether we ultimately rebuild our marriage or find separate paths, I'm grateful for the boundaries you established. I waited, giving him space to continue. They forced a reckoning that was long overdue, he continued. Not just about money, but about honesty. About what success actually means. About the difference between appearance and substance. He met my gaze directly. You gave my family the opportunity to face reality, even though we fought it every step of the way. That was an act of courage, not cruelty. The acknowledgement carried healing power beyond any apology could have achieved. Not because it absolved past actions, but because it demonstrated genuine understanding of why the boundaries had been necessary. Thank you for seeing that, I said simply. We parted with a brief embrace, warmer than politeness required, but carrying less intimacy than our past would have suggested. Another accurate reflection of our current state, connecting with renewed authenticity while respecting the distance still between us. As I drove home, I reflected on the journey of the past months. The financial boundaries I'd established had indeed changed everything, not by destroying what existed before, but by creating space for something more authentic to emerge. Not just in my marriage, but in the entire Wilson family ecosystem. The following weekend brought Claire's graduation ceremony at the State University. I arrived separately from Daniel, who had coordinated transportation for his parents from their new condominium. The arrangement felt appropriate for our current circumstances, connected but not artificially unified, present without pretense. The ceremony itself was pleasantly ordinary. Hundreds of graduating students in identical caps and gowns, proud families crowding the university auditorium, the predictable cycle of speeches and name-calling. What made it extraordinary was the Wilson family's approach to the occasion. In previous years, such an event would have been orchestrated as a showcase of their status. Robert would have arranged premium seating through trustee connections. Margaret would have planned an extravagant private celebration at an exclusive venue. The entire experience would have been designed to emphasize their social position rather than Claire's accomplishment. Today, they sat in standard seating like every other family. They had reserved a table at a popular campus restaurant for the celebration. Nice, but not exclusive. Margaret wore a lovely but not ostentatious outfit, while Robert had abandoned his customary bespoke suit for business casual attire. Jessica, Margaret greeted me with a genuine smile as I joined them in the auditorium. Thank you for coming. Claire will be so pleased. The warmth in her voice carried no undertone of resentment or forced politeness, another small indicator of the gradual shift in our relationship. Robert's greeting was more reserved but civil, his handshake firm as he nodded acknowledgement. The business expansion is proceeding well, I understand, he said after initial pleasantries. Daniel mentioned the quarterly projections were exceptional. Coming from Robert Wilson, this constituted significant evolution. He was acknowledging Luminous as a legitimate enterprise worthy of business conversation, not dismissing it as a hobby or craft project. Yes, the national distribution has exceeded our growth targets, I replied, maintaining professional composure while appreciating the shift his comment represented. Your timing was impeccable, he continued, surprising me further. Entering major retail at the beginning of an economic upswing. Strategic. The observation was delivered without condescension, a straightforward acknowledgement of business acumen from someone who had previously refused to recognize its existence. Before I could respond, the ceremony began, drawing our attention to the stage where university officials had begun their processional. Throughout the event, I found myself observing the Wilsons as much as the graduation activities, noting Robert's restrained applause, Margaret's genuine tears when Claire's name was called, the absence of whispered comparisons to more prestigious universities or subtle references to family connections. After the ceremony, we gathered outside the auditorium for photographs. Claire, radiant in her graduation regalia, hugged me with unexpected warmth. Thanks for coming, she said quietly. And for, she hesitated, searching for words. For helping us face reality, I guess, even when we fought it. The acknowledgement, so similar to Daniel's recent statement, suggested that the Wilson family was collectively processing the changes of recent months, not just the practical adjustments, but the philosophical recalibration they necessitated. The celebration lunch that followed carried a different energy than previous Wilson family gatherings. The conversation included genuine questions about my business rather than polite dismissals. Claire spoke enthusiastically about her upcoming internship with the conservation nonprofit, an opportunity she had secured on merit rather than family connections. Most notably, when the check arrived, Robert handled it without drama. No ostentatious flourish, no comments about expensive tastes, no subtle references to his generosity. He simply covered his daughter's graduation lunch as any parent might, within his means and without performance. As the meal concluded, Margaret drew me aside for a private word, her expression unexpectedly vulnerable. "I've been wanting to tell you something," she said, her typical polish temporarily set aside. "The financial counselor you recommended has been illuminating. Not just about budgets and investment strategies, but about our relationship with money, with appearance." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "He said something that keeps resonating, that we've been using financial resources to purchase the appearance of worth rather than investing in actual value." The insight was surprisingly profound coming from Margaret, who had spent decades perfecting the art of impression management. "It's been difficult," she continued, "letting go of certain expectations, certain assumptions about what success looks like. But there's also," she searched for the right word, "freedom in facing the truth, in right-sizing our lives to reality." I nodded, giving her space to continue this unexpected moment of authenticity. "I want you to know," she said, meeting my gaze directly, "that while I didn't appreciate it at the time, the boundaries you established were necessary. Painful, yes, but necessary." The acknowledgement carried weight beyond the words themselves, representing a fundamental shift in Margaret's understanding of both the situation and my role within it. "Thank you for seeing that," I replied simply, echoing my response to Daniel's similar recognition. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Robert approached, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Jessica," he began formally, "I've been advised by our financial counselor to make certain amends as part of our adjustment process." The phrasing was stiff, clearly uncomfortable, but he continued. "My treatment of your business was dismissive. Incorrectly so, as events have proven. I failed to recognize legitimate success because it didn't conform to my expectations of what success should look like." The statement fell short of a full apology, but represented significant movement from his previous position. For Robert Wilson, acknowledging misjudgment required overcoming decades of certainty in his own infallibility. "I appreciate that recognition," I replied, maintaining the formal tone he'd established. He nodded briskly, having fulfilled what he clearly viewed as an obligation rather than a heartfelt expression. "Claire mentioned you might be willing to speak to her nonprofit about sustainable business practices. If your schedule permits, I believe she would value the insight." Another small but noteworthy evolution. Robert acknowledging that I possessed expertise worth sharing, that my business experience had value beyond financial gain. "I'd be happy to," I confirmed, watching Claire's face brighten at the exchange. As we said our goodbyes in the restaurant parking lot, I observed the Wilson family with fresh eyes, noting both the changes and the consistencies in their interactions. They had adjusted to significant practical realities, begun questioning long-held values, and taken tentative steps toward more authentic engagement with themselves and others. Yet certain patterns remained: Robert's need to control narratives, Margaret's concern with external perceptions, the family's reflexive positioning within social hierarchies. Real change happened gradually, with fits and starts, progress intermingled with reversion to comfortable habits. The financial boundaries I'd established had initiated their journey, But the distance they traveled and the lessons they internalized would ultimately be determined by their own choices, their own willingness to embrace reality over comforting fiction. Daniel walked me to my car after the family photographs concluded. "That went better than I expected," he observed, hands in his pockets as we crossed the parking lot. "Your mother has been doing some genuine reflection," I noted, sharing the essence of our conversation without betraying confidences. He nodded thoughtfully. "The financial counselor suggested family therapy. Surprisingly, she agreed. Dad's still resistant, but considering it." Another indicator of shifting perspectives, Margaret Wilson, who had previously maintained that appearances should be managed privately rather than discussed with strangers, now willing to engage professional support for emotional as well as financial recalibration. "How's the apartment?" I asked, referencing his recent move to the month-to-month rental. "Clarifying," he replied after consideration. "Having separate space has helped me distinguish between what I actually think versus what I was conditioned to believe. About money, about success, about..." He hesitated. "About us." I waited, giving him room to elaborate if he chose. "I've realized how much of our marriage was performance," he continued carefully. "Not just for my parents, but for an imagined audience. The successful banker and his supportive wife. The perfect Wilson family extension." He shook his head ruefully. "I never stopped to ask what you actually wanted. What I actually wanted. Whether the script we were following made either of us happy." The insight reflected the ongoing personal inventory he'd been conducting, reassessing not just his career choices but the fundamental values and assumptions that had shaped his approach to life and relationships. "And now?" I asked. "What do you want now?" Daniel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Authenticity," he finally replied. "In my work, in my relationships, in how I measure success." He met my gaze directly. "I'm still figuring out what that looks like in practice, but I know it doesn't involve hiding your achievements to protect my ego or spending money we don't have to impress people who don't matter." We reached my car, pausing by the driver's door in the afternoon sunshine. Around us, other families celebrated their graduates, their ordinary joy untainted by the performative pressures the Wilsons had imposed on every occasion. "The boundaries you set," Daniel said quietly. "They were the first honest thing in our relationship in years. Painful, yes. Disruptive, certainly. But honest in a way we hadn't been with each other or ourselves." I nodded, acknowledging the truth in his assessment. "I don't know if we find our way back to partnership from here," he continued with unexpected candor. "But whatever happens, I'm grateful for the wake-up call, for the chance to build something real, whether together or separately." The statement carried no pressure, no expectation, just a genuine expression of where he stood in his own journey of recalibration. It reflected the growth he'd undertaken, the willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than grasping for comfortable fiction, to acknowledge possibility without demanding guarantees. "I appreciate that," I replied simply. "And I feel the same way." We parted with another of those in-between embraces, warmer than politeness, less intimate than history would suggest, accurately reflecting our current state of honest exploration rather than performed certainty. As I drove away from the university campus, I reflected on the cascade of changes that had unfolded from that pivotal moment of boundary setting. Financial realities confronted, personal fictions challenged, relationships recalibrated based on truth rather than expectation. The process remained unfinished, the outcomes still unfolding. But the foundation had shifted from appearance to authenticity, from performance to reality, creating space for growth that, while painful, offered the possibility of genuine connection previously buried beneath layers of pretense and performance. The financial boundaries I'd established had indeed changed everything. Not by destroying what existed before, but by creating the possibility for something more genuine to emerge. If we were brave enough to embrace it, honest enough to nurture it, and patient enough to let it develop at its own authentic pace. 4 months after Claire's graduation, I stood in Luminous headquarters' expanded manufacturing space, watching as our production team prepared the holiday collection for shipment. The gleaming equipment, quality control stations, and efficient workflow represented everything we'd built over years of careful growth, a stark contrast to the little hobby the Wilsons had dismissed for so long. Final numbers just came in. From the West Coast Distribution Center, Natalie reported, tablet in hand as she joined me on the production floor. We're tracking 15% above projections for the quarter. I nodded, satisfaction warming me despite the Minnesota autumn chill seeping through the warehouse windows. How are the staffing adjustments working out? The national expansion had necessitated restructuring our team, promoting from within where possible and bringing in specialized talent where needed. Maintaining our company culture through rapid growth had been among my primary concerns. Smoother than expected, Natalie replied. The new hires are integrating well, and the team leads you promoted are thriving with the additional responsibility. We continued our walkthrough, discussing inventory management, quality control procedures, and sustainability initiatives. Every aspect of the operation reflected years of careful planning suddenly accelerated by our retail success. The company I'd built from my kitchen table now employed 75 people across 3 locations, with annual revenue approaching 8 figures. Home and Style magazine called again, Natalie mentioned as we returned to the administrative section. They're finalizing their Women Entrepreneurs to Watch feature and want to schedule the photo shoot. Another milestone, national press recognition beyond industry publications. 5 years ago, I'd have been thrilled by such attention. Today, I accepted it as a natural evolution of our growth strategy, neither dismissing its significance nor overinflating its importance. Schedule it for next week, I decided, and make sure we showcase the production team, not just me. This success belongs to everyone who helped build it. Back in my office, I reviewed quarterly projections while absently noting the date on my calendar. Exactly 7 months since that pivotal dinner when I'd finally established clear financial boundaries with the Wilsons. 7 months of transformation, recalibration, and unexpected growth, not just for Luminous, but for all the relationships that had been distorted by years of financial fiction. My reflection was interrupted by my assistant. Claire Wilson is here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment but says it won't take long. I looked up in surprise. While my relationship with Daniel's sister had improved significantly in recent months, unscheduled visits weren't part of our evolving dynamic. Send her in, I replied, curious about this unexpected development. Claire entered tentatively, her appearance a study in contrasts from the privileged young woman I'd first met 3 years ago. Gone were the designer clothes and carefully curated accessories that had once been her uniform. Instead, she wore practical business casual attire, her only jewelry a simple pendant necklace I recognized as a family heirloom rather than an expensive purchase. I'm sorry to drop in unannounced, she began, remaining standing despite my gesture toward a visitor chair. I was in the area for a meeting and wanted to speak with you directly rather than calling. Of course, I replied, genuinely curious. Is everything all right? She nodded, finally taking the offered seat. Everything's fine. Better than fine, actually. She squared her shoulders, a gesture reminiscent of her father gathering resolve. I wanted to thank you personally for the speaker engagement last month at the conservation nonprofit. Your presentation on sustainable business practices was exactly what our board needed to hear. I smiled, recalling the event she referenced. I'd agreed to present to the nonprofit's board about incorporating sustainability into their operational planning, an organization where Claire had progressed from intern to junior program coordinator in recent months. I was happy to contribute, I replied honestly. Your organization is doing important work. Claire nodded, then continued with uncharacteristic directness. "That's not the only reason I wanted to see you. I've been accepted to the Environmental Management Master's program at the State University. Classes start next semester." "Congratulations," I said warmly, recognizing this development as significant. Claire had previously dismissed state universities as beneath Wilson family standards, a perspective reinforced by her parents throughout her upbringing. "It's a practical degree with real-world applications," she continued, a hint of her old defensiveness briefly surfacing. "Not just a prestigious name on a diploma." The qualification revealed ongoing internal dialogue, still justifying choices that contradicted her former value system, while embracing their authentic alignment with her emerging interests. "The practical application is what makes it valuable," I agreed, supporting her perspective without challenging the lingering defensiveness. Claire hesitated, then continued with visible effort. "I also wanted to thank you for setting those boundaries. With my parents. With our family." The words clearly cost her something to deliver. "At the time, it felt like you were destroying everything. Now I see you were actually creating space for something different to grow." The insight surprised me, particularly coming from Claire, who had initially been among the most vocal critics of the financial boundaries I'd established. She had viewed the resulting lifestyle adjustments as punitive rather than necessary, as personal attack rather than overdue correction. "I appreciate that perspective," I replied carefully. "Change is rarely comfortable, especially when it challenges long-held assumptions." Claire nodded, a rueful smile briefly crossing her face. "The Wilson family had a lot of assumptions that needed challenging." She straightened, shifting to a more businesslike tone. "Anyway, I wanted to deliver that thanks in person, and to ask if you might consider serving on the advisory board for the nonprofit's new Youth Environmental Leadership Program. Your business experience would be invaluable." The request represented another evolution in our relationship, Claire recognizing my professional expertise and seeking it out, rather than dismissing or resenting it. "Send me the details," I replied. "I'd like to learn more about the program before committing, but I'm certainly interested." After Claire left, I sat reflecting on the interaction and its significance within the larger pattern of change unfolding across the Wilson family ecosystem. Each family member was navigating their own journey of recalibration at their own pace, with varying degrees of resistance and acceptance. Claire had perhaps traveled furthest, from entitled college student expecting luxury as birthright to young professional embracing meaningful work and education on their own merits. Margaret had surprised everyone with her capacity for adaptation, finding unexpected satisfaction in simpler pleasures once freed from the exhausting performance of wealth. Robert continued struggling, his identity so thoroughly entwined with appearances that reality still chafed like an ill-fitting garment. And Daniel occupied the most complex position in this transformation. Son of the Wilson legacy, husband in our evolving marriage, individual seeking authentic purpose. After years of performative success, his journey intersected with everyone else's while remaining distinctly his own. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel himself. "Dinner tomorrow? Something to discuss." The message carried no clues about his intended topic, maintaining the careful neutrality we'd established in recent months. Since moving to his own apartment, our interactions had developed a refreshing honesty, sometimes uncomfortable, but always authentic, free from the pressure to maintain convenient fictions. I confirmed the dinner plan, then returned to quarterly projections and expansion strategy, the rhythm of business providing familiar structure amid personal uncertainties. Whatever Daniel wished to discuss, I would approach it with the same commitment to truth that had guided every interaction since that pivotal boundary-setting dinner. The following evening, I arrived at Riverside Terrace, a moderately priced restaurant overlooking the Mississippi, neither budget-conscious nor ostentatious, a thoughtful middle ground that reflected our current dynamic. Daniel was already seated. At a table near the windows, a glass of mineral water rather than his once habitual expensive scotch at his elbow. "You look well," he observed as I joined him, the comment a simple observation rather than performative flattery. "The magazine feature Natalie mentioned must be keeping you busy." I nodded, appreciating his genuine interest in my professional developments. "Photography next week. They're highlighting women executives who've built sustainable businesses." "You'll represent that category perfectly," he replied with authentic pride. Another marker of his evolution from the man who had once hidden my success to protect his ego. "Claire mentioned she visited your office yesterday, said the headquarters expansion was impressive." "She seemed well," I offered. "The nonprofit position suits her." Daniel smiled, a genuine expression lighting his features. "She's found her calling. Turns out when you remove the pressure to impress everyone, you create space to discover what actually matters to you." He shook his head slightly. "Who would have thought environmental advocacy would capture a Wilson?" The observation carried. No judgment, just appreciation for his sister's authentic development. We ordered dinner, the conversation flowing with comfortable honesty through updates on Luminous, Daniel's teaching position, and mutual acquaintances. Only after our entrees arrived did Daniel broach what appeared to be his intended topic. "The university has offered me a permanent position," he said, setting down his fork to give the statement proper weight. "Full-time faculty in the business. Ethics department, starting next semester." The news represented a significant milestone in his professional recalibration, moving from temporary adjunct teaching while maintaining his banking position to fully committing to an academic career. "That's wonderful," I replied sincerely. "Your student evaluations must have been exceptional." He nodded, a hint of well-earned pride in his expression. The department chair mentioned student feedback specifically, said my real-world perspective on ethical failures in finance was particularly valuable. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Daniel's first-hand experience with ethical compromises within the Wilson family financial ecosystem now serving as valuable teaching material. His understanding of how easily principles could be sacrificed for appearances gave him unique insight into the very subject he now taught. "Will you accept the position?" I asked, though his expression suggested the decision was already made. "I've already given notice at the bank," he confirmed. "My last day is next month." The decision represented more than a career change. It signified final liberation from his father's expectations, the definitive choice of authentic interest over prescribed success, of meaningful work over status symbols. "How did Robert take the news?" I asked carefully, knowing his father's reaction would carry emotional significance regardless of Daniel's evolved perspective. A complicated expression crossed Daniel's face. "Better than expected, actually," said. "Something about influencing the next generation of business leaders being its own form of legacy." He shrugged slightly, his way of finding status in a choice he would have condemned a year ago. The observation contained no bitterness, just clear-eyed recognition of his father's ongoing need to position family choices within acceptable narratives of success and influence. "And financially?" I asked practically, knowing the academic position would represent a significant reduction from his banking salary, even with the latter's previous reduction. "That's partly what I wanted to discuss," Daniel replied, his expression turning more serious. "The university salary is adequate but modest. I've calculated my budget moving forward and can maintain financial independence, but certain adjustments will be necessary." I nodded, appreciating both his practical planning and his commitment to financial self-sufficiency. Another evolution from the man who had once casually redirected my business profits to maintain appearances. "I'm listing the boat for sale," he continued, referencing the small recreational vessel he'd purchased early in our marriage, a modest pleasure craft compared to his father's yacht, but still an expense that had consumed resources better directed elsewhere. "And I'm considering making the apartment arrangement permanent. At least until my financial situation stabilizes with the new position. The statement carried multiple layers of significance. Practical financial recalibration, coupled with continued commitment to the separate space that had facilitated our mutual reflection. That seems sensible, I replied neutrally, respecting the boundaries he was establishing around his own financial independence. Daniel nodded, then continued with careful deliberation. There's something else I'd like to discuss. Something more personal. I waited, giving him space to proceed at his own pace. These months apart have been, he searched for the right word, clarifying, about what I want, what matters, who I actually am when I'm not performing success for an audience. I nodded, having experienced similar clarity through our separation. I've realized I don't want a divorce, he said directly, meeting my gaze. But I also don't want to return to what we had before, the unconscious performance, the financial deception, the priorities that were never actually discussed, just assumed. The statement hung between us, not a simple request for reconciliation, but an acknowledgement of both desire and recognition of necessary transformation. What do you want instead? I asked, the question genuine rather than challenging. Daniel considered carefully before responding. I want the chance to build something authentic, a relationship based on who we actually are, what we actually value, where we're actually heading. He paused. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, just opening the conversation about whether that's something you might also want to explore. The proposal reflected both his personal growth and respect for my autonomy. No presumption of entitlement, no emotional manipulation, just honest expression of desire, coupled with recognition of my equal voice in the decision. I appreciate your directness, I replied, matching his honesty. I need time to consider what that might look like for me, for us. He nodded, accepting this response without disappointment or pressure. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Metaphorically speaking, at least. The physical apartment remains necessary for practical reasons. The clarification carried a hint of his developing humor about the situation, the ability to acknowledge its complexity without defaulting to defensiveness or denial. As dinner continued, our conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the question he'd raised remained present in the background, not demanding immediate answer, but inviting thoughtful consideration. By the time we parted in the restaurant parking lot, I'd promised only to reflect on his proposal, neither accepting nor rejecting the possibility of rebuilding our relationship on new foundations. Driving home to the house that remained solely in my name, I considered the 7-month journey that had brought us to this juncture. The financial boundaries I'd established had created cascading effects far beyond monetary considerations, challenging identities, transforming values, revealing authentic desires previously buried beneath performative success. For the Wilson family, these changes had manifested differently across individuals, Claire finding meaningful purpose, Margaret discovering unexpected contentment in simplicity, Robert struggling to redefine success without wealth signifiers, Daniel reclaiming authentic interest over prescribed achievement. For me, the transformation had been equally profound but more internal. Confidence in my boundaries, clarity about my values, certainty about what I would and wouldn't compromise to maintain relationships. The successful entrepreneur the Wilsons had dismissed was now fully visible, unapologetically claiming her achievements while maintaining perspective about their true significance. The question remaining unanswered was whether Daniel and I could build something new atop this foundation of authentic self-knowledge. Not reclaiming what was lost, but creating something that had never truly existed between us. A partnership, based on mutual respect, shared values, and unflinching honesty. The following morning brought practical concerns back to the forefront as I prepared for a board meeting to review Luminous's expansion strategy. The company continued thriving, our holiday collection shipping to retailers nationwide, our product development team already designing spring innovations. Business success provided steady ground beneath my feet, while personal questions remained fluid and evolving. That afternoon, my assistant announced an unexpected visitor, Margaret Wilson, requesting a few minutes if my schedule permitted. Curious about this unplanned visit, I agreed to see her between meetings. Margaret entered my office with surprising confidence, her appearance reflecting the ongoing evolution in her circumstances. Her clothing remained tasteful, but had lost the ostentatious designer flourishes that once dominated her wardrobe. Her manner carried dignity without the brittle formality that had previously characterized our interactions. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment," she began, taking the offered visitor chair. "I was downtown for a volunteer orientation and thought I might catch you between meetings." "Volunteer orientation?" I inquired, genuinely interested in this development. Margaret nodded, a hint of enthusiasm warming her typically composed expression. "At the Community Foundation. I've joined their fundraising committee for education initiatives." She smoothed her skirt with a familiar gesture. "Turns out my experience planning charity galas has practical application, even without a Wilson-sized budget behind it." The self-awareness in her observation represented significant growth from the woman who had once measured events solely by their exclusivity and expense. "That sounds fulfilling," I replied, appreciating her discovery of meaningful contribution beyond status performances. "Surprisingly so," she acknowledged with candor. "But that's not why I stopped by." She reached into her handbag, withdrawing an envelope. "Robert and I are hosting a small dinner next weekend. Nothing elaborate, just family and a few close friends. We'd be honored if you would attend." The invitation represented multiple layers of significance. The Wilsons were entertaining again, but small and nothing elaborate signaled alignment with their adjusted circumstances rather than straining beyond their means. More notably, Margaret had delivered the invitation personally rather than simply including me in Daniel's general family obligation. "Thank you," I replied, accepting the envelope. "I'll check my calendar." Margaret nodded, then continued with uncharacteristic directness. "We're celebrating Robert's retirement, official this time, not just the semi-retirement he's claimed for years while trying to salvage the business." The candor about her husband's previously disguised business struggles represented another evolution in Margaret's relationship with truth versus appearance. "That's a significant milestone," I observed neutrally. "It is," she agreed, "particularly the acceptance part. The financial counselor has been instrumental in helping him recognize that his worth isn't determined by business achievement." She paused. "It's been a difficult journey, but necessary." The acknowledgement of Robert's struggle carried no resentment toward me for precipitating it, just clear-eyed recognition of necessary transitions long deferred. "He's considering volunteer mentorship with retiring business owners," Margaret continued, "using his experience, both successes and failures, to help others navigate the transition with more grace than he initially managed." The development suggested Robert was finding constructive channels for his need to maintain identity as a business authority, while simultaneously acknowledging the reality of his circumstances, another step in the family's ongoing recalibration. "That sounds valuable," I offered sincerely. "Experience with both sides of the entrepreneurial journey provides unique perspective." Margaret nodded, then added with surprising vulnerability, "We've also begun family therapy. Robert, Claire, Daniel, and myself, working through certain—" She searched for appropriate phrasing, "patterns that haven't served us well." The disclosure represented perhaps the most significant evolution in Wilson family dynamics: willingness to examine multi-generational patterns of prioritizing appearance over authenticity, external validation over internal worth, performance over genuine connection. "That takes courage," I observed quietly. "It does," Margaret acknowledged, "particularly for Robert. Acknowledging the impact of his father's expectations on his own parenting choices hasn't been easy." She straightened, resuming her more typical composure. "Anyway, we hope you'll join us. Modest gathering, modest home, but genuine invitation." As she rose to leave, Margaret paused, adding one final thought. "The boundaries you established? They were painful, undeniably. But looking back, they were the wake-up call our family needed." Her expression carried complicated emotions: regret, gratitude, resignation. Sometimes the kindest thing isn't continued enabling, but a firm redirection toward reality. The insight revealed depths to Margaret I'd never glimpsed during our previous interactions. Capacity for self-reflection, willingness to acknowledge destructive patterns, courage to embrace uncomfortable growth. After she departed, I sat, contemplating the invitation and its significance within the larger narrative unfolding across the Wilson family ecosystem. 7 months since those boundary-establishing confrontations, each family member continued navigating their individual journey of recalibration, each finding their own path toward authenticity at their own pace, with varying degrees of acceptance and resistance. My phone lit up with a message from Daniel. "Mom mentioned she stopped by. No pressure about the dinner either way. Your choice entirely." The simple text represented another small indicator of his evolution, respecting my autonomy rather than assuming compliance with family expectations, acknowledging potential complication without demanding accommodation. I replied with equally simple acknowledgement, then turned my attention back to business operations. The question of attendance remained open, like so many aspects of my evolving relationship with the Wilson family, to be decided based on authentic desire rather than obligation or avoidance. That evening, I walked through my home, the property I'd purchased with early luminous profits, the space that remained mine alone throughout my marriage, despite Robert's pointed commentary about men providing homes for their wives, not vice versa. Its rooms had witnessed the entire arc of my relationship with the Wilson family, from early efforts to gain approval to recent establishment of unapologetic boundaries. In my home office, I reviewed the business journey that had paralleled that. Personal evolution, from kitchen table startup to national retail presence, from sole proprietor to employer of 75. The growth hadn't been without challenges, setbacks, and difficult decisions, but each phase had built upon authentic foundation, each expansion aligned with genuine values rather than external expectations. The Wilson family was attempting similar, authentic rebuilding in their personal ecosystem, replacing performative success with meaningful contribution, external validation with internal worth, appearance management with genuine connection. Their journey remained incomplete, their transformations uneven across individuals, their new patterns not yet fully established. And my place within that ecosystem remained equally undetermined, connected through history and relationship, yet maintaining independence through clearly established boundaries. Daniel's dinner invitation had opened conversation about rebuilding our marriage on new foundations. Margaret's visit had extended tentative family reconnection on more authentic terms. My responses to both remained within my control, to be determined by genuine desire rather than obligation or habit. The financial boundaries I'd established 7 months earlier had indeed changed everything, creating space for truth to replace fiction, for authenticity to replace performance, for genuine worth to replace external validation. The full implications of those changes continued unfolding, their final configuration still emerging from the sometimes painful process of growth and recalibration. Whatever shape my relationship with the Wilson family ultimately took, whether renewed marriage partnership with Daniel, friendly distance with his parents, or some configuration yet unimagined, it would be built upon the solid foundation of clearly established boundaries, unapologetic authenticity, and unflinching honesty. The transformation hadn't been easy for anyone involved, but standing in my home, surrounded by evidence of both personal and professional integrity, I recognize that difficult truth invariably creates better outcomes than comfortable fiction, even When the path toward that truth requires disrupting every pattern and challenging every assumption previously taken for granted, the financial boundaries I'd established had changed everything indeed, not by destroying what existed before, but by creating space for something authentic to finally emerge from beneath the crushing weight of appearances, expectations, and illusions. The day of Robert Wilson's retirement dinner arrived with perfect autumn clarity, the Minnesota air crisp with the promise of approaching winter. I stood in my closet, considering appropriate attire for an occasion that represented another milestone in the family's ongoing transformation. After careful deliberation, I selected an outfit that reflected my current reality, successful but not ostentatious, polished but not performative. Exactly 1 year had passed since that pivotal dinner, when I'd finally established clear financial boundaries with the Wilsons. 12 months of recalibration, reflection, and rebuilding. Not just for me, but for every member of the family ecosystem that had been sustained through financial fiction. The drive to the Wilsons' condominium took me through neighborhoods I rarely visited, the modest high-rise representing dramatically different circumstances from their former lakeside mansion. Practical considerations aside, I found myself appreciating their choice. The building was well-maintained, the location convenient to cultural amenities, the overall impression one of sensible comfort rather than straining beyond means. Daniel had texted that he would meet me in the lobby, a thoughtful buffer for what represented my first visit to his parents' new home. When I arrived, he was waiting as promised, his expression warming at the sight of me. "Thanks for coming," he said. Simply, "It means a lot to them and to me." His appearance reflected his own evolution. The banking professional's armor of expensive suits, replaced by academic business casual. His posture more relaxed, his expression more genuine. The professor of business ethics had visibly integrated his teaching material into personal practice. "How are they doing with the occasion?" I asked as we entered the elevator. Daniel considered the question thoughtfully. "Dad's a mix of emotions, relieved to officially close that chapter, still adjusting to his new identity beyond successful businessman. Mom's actually doing better than expected. She's embraced the role of gracious hostess within new parameters." The observation reflected ongoing family therapy work, recognizing emotions without judgment, acknowledging transitions without catastrophizing them, finding authentic satisfaction within adjusted circumstances. "Claire's already here with her boyfriend," Daniel added as the elevator ascended. "Did she mention him?" I shook my head, intrigued by this development. Claire's dating choices had previously been guided entirely by parental approval and social advancement. Young men from appropriate families with appropriate prospects, regardless of genuine connection. "Environmental science graduate student," Daniel elaborated with a small smile. "Brilliant, passionate about conservation, drives a 15-year-old hybrid. Dad's still adjusting to that particular development." The elevator opened directly into a small private foyer, the condominium building's concession to residents accustomed to greater privacy. Margaret Wilson opened the door before we could knock, her welcome genuinely warm rather than performatively perfect. "Jessica, I'm so glad you could join us," she said. The formality that had once characterized our every interaction noticeably softened. "Please come in." The condominium itself revealed thoughtful adaptation to changed circumstances. Smaller, but not cramped, tastefully appointed but not extravagant. Family photographs and meaningful art pieces that had been lost among excessive display items in the mansion now received proper attention in more modest surroundings. Claire approached immediately, accompanied by a young man whose earnest expression and casual attire confirmed Daniel's description. "Jessica, this is Ethan. He's been helping develop the environmental education curriculum for the nonprofit." Introductions flowed naturally into conversation about the program where I'd spoken months earlier. Ethan's genuine enthusiasm for the work shone through without social performance or status signaling, qualities that would have been unacceptable in Claire's social circle a year ago, but now seemed comfortably integrated into her evolving value system. Robert Wilson's greeting carried more complexity, formal but not cold, his handshake firm as he welcomed me to our more modest home. The qualification revealed ongoing adjustment to changed circumstances, but the absence of bitterness or accusation represented significant progress from our last interaction. "Daniel mentioned your teaching position has been made permanent," I said, offering neutral conversation ground. Robert nodded, his expression warming at the mention of his son's new career path. "He's found his calling, it seems." His department chair called me personally to comment on student feedback. Apparently, real-world perspective on ethical failures makes for compelling education. The observation carried no resentment at the implied reference to family patterns, just wry acknowledgement of lessons learned through difficult experience, another indicator of therapy's impact on family communication patterns. Dinner itself was served in the condominium's modest dining area, the table comfortably seating, the small gathering without the ostentatious display that had characterized previous Wilson family occasions. The meal was excellent but not excessive, the wine quality but not showy, the conversation flowing with surprising ease across topics previously considered taboo in Wilson gatherings. Financial realities were referenced without shame or dissembling. Claire and Ethan discussed nonprofit budget constraints with practical acceptance rather than apologetic embarrassment. Margaret mentioned community foundation work without positioning it as charity bestowed from above. Robert acknowledged retirement adjustments with occasional humor rather than defensive posturing. The financial counselor suggested I develop a hobby, he mentioned during the main course. Something with no profit motive whatsoever, just enjoyment for its own sake. "Dad's taken up birdwatching," Claire explained with a hint of lingering disbelief. "He's got 3 different field guides and premium binoculars. Identifying species requires attention to detail," Robert said with unexpected humility. "Skills transferable from business, though the birds are considerably less impressed by my credentials." The self-deprecating humor represented remarkable evolution from the man who had once measured all activity by its status-generating potential. Even more notable was the authentic engagement with an activity chosen for personal satisfaction rather than external validation. Throughout the meal, I observed the Wilson family dynamics with fresh perspective, noting both the changes and the consistencies in their interactions. The foundational patterns remained recognizable: Margaret's focus on presentation, Robert's need for authority, Claire's sensitivity to approval. But these core tendencies now operated within healthier boundaries, tempered by self-awareness and mutual accountability. Family therapy had clearly provided language for patterns previously enacted unconsciously. More than once, I heard gentle references to old scripts when conversation veered toward familiar territory. I watched Margaret catch herself mid-perfectionism. Robert paused before issuing directives. Claire breathed through moments of seeking external validation. These small course corrections revealed the ongoing nature of their work. Not completed transformation, but conscious navigation of deeply ingrained patterns with increasing awareness and intentionality. After dessert was served, Robert stood, calling for attention with the familiar authority of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. Yet something in his posture had shifted. Less performance, more authenticity in his natural leadership presence. "I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening," he began, raising his water glass rather than the crystal tumblers that had once been his signature. "This past year has brought changes none of us anticipated or initially welcomed. Yet, standing here now, I find myself remarkably grateful for the wake-up call they provided." His gaze briefly met mine, a moment of direct acknowledgement without resentment or blame, just recognition of catalyst role in necessary change. Our family spent generations equating worth with wealth, success with appearance, connection with performance, he continued with surprising candor. We pursued facades at the expense of substance. We maintained appearances while losing touch with reality. Margaret reached for his hand, offering silent support for this vulnerable disclosure. Claire and Ethan exchanged a glance of gentle recognition. Daniel's expression reflected both grief and relief at hearing his father articulate patterns that had shaped his entire upbringing. The boundaries that forced us to face financial reality, Robert continued carefully, ultimately created space for something more valuable to grow: honesty with ourselves and each other. Authentic connection not dependent on performance or appearance. He raised his glass slightly higher. So tonight we celebrate not just my retirement from business, but perhaps our collective retirement from exhausting pretense, from keeping up appearances that served no one, from measuring worth by metrics that never truly mattered. The toast concluded with genuine warmth rather than performative flourish. The conversation that followed carried the same quality of authentic engagement, sometimes awkward in its honesty, but refreshingly free from the careful calculation that had characterized previous family gatherings. As the evening drew to a close, Margaret walked me to the door while Daniel helped Claire and Ethan gather materials for an early morning presentation. In the relative privacy of the entrance foyer, she spoke with unexpected directness. "The financial boundaries you established were the best thing that could have happened to this family," she said quietly. "Not that we saw it that way initially." I nodded, acknowledging both the truth of her statement and the journey required to reach such perspective. "Robert and I were discussing recently how much energy we spent maintaining appearances," she continued thoughtfully. "How exhausting it was to constantly manage impressions rather than simply living authentically." She shook her head slightly. "All those years of performance, and for what? An audience that disappeared the moment the show stopped." The insight revealed genuine self-reflection rather than performative wisdom. Margaret Wilson actually examining the value system that had guided decades of her life choices. "The irony is that I feel more secure now," she admitted with a small smile. "With less money, less status, less of everything we thought essential. Because what we have is actually ours, not a facade maintained through financial fiction." Daniel joined us, carrying my coat with thoughtful attention. "Ready?" As we said our goodbyes, warmer and more genuine than any previous Wilson family farewell, I reflected on the journey that had brought us all to this moment. The financial boundaries I'd established had indeed changed everything, though not in ways any of us could have anticipated when first implemented. Daniel walked me to my car, the night air sharp with approaching winter. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, neither rushing to fill space with unnecessary words, another evolution in our interaction patterns. "Thank you for coming tonight," he finally said. "It meant a lot to everyone." I nodded, acknowledging both the invitation and the family's ongoing journey. "They're doing really well with the transitions. All of you are." Daniel smiled, his expression visible in the parking area lighting. "Some days better than others. The therapy helps. Naming patterns makes them harder to unconsciously perpetuate." He shrugged slightly. "We're works in progress." The simple acknowledgement of ongoing development rather than completed transformation reflected his growing comfort with process over performance, journey over destination. "About the question I raised," he continued carefully, referencing our previous dinner conversation about potentially rebuilding our relationship. "I've been thinking about something you said months ago, that whatever we built moving forward needed to be founded on truth rather than convenience or appearance." I waited, giving him space to continue at his own pace. "I realize now that includes the truth that we've both changed fundamentally through this process," he said thoughtfully. "We're not the same people who married each other. Maybe that means building something new rather than trying to repair what existed before." The insight reflected genuine personal growth, recognition that transformation necessarily changed relationship equations, that authentic connection required acknowledging evolution rather than attempting to recapture previous dynamics. "I'd like to propose something," he continued with careful deliberation. Not moving back in together, not picking up where we left off, but he searched for the right words. Dating again, getting to know who we've become, exploring whether these new versions of ourselves fit together in ways the old versions couldn't. The suggestion carried no pressure, no expectation, just honest proposal of possibility without demanding certainty. Another indicator of his evolution from the man who had once approached relationship as performance requiring guaranteed outcomes. "I think I'd like that," I replied after thoughtful consideration. "Starting fresh with who we are now, not who we were trying to be then." Daniel smiled, a genuine expression free from the careful calculation that had once characterized his responses. "Tomorrow night? Dinner at that new place downtown? I hear they have excellent food but zero importance as a status destination." The small joke acknowledged our shared history while suggesting different priorities moving forward. Connection valued above appearance, substance above performance. "I'll meet you there," I agreed. As I drove home through the quiet Minneapolis streets, I reflected on the anniversary this day represented. 1 year since establishing financial boundaries that had cascading effects far beyond monetary considerations. 12 months of transformation, recalibration, and rebuilding, different for each person involved, yet interconnected through family ecosystem. For the Wilson family, the journey continued along individual paths toward more authentic living. Robert finding identity beyond business success through volunteer mentorship and unexpected hobbies. Margaret discovering meaningful contribution through community foundation work rather than social performance. Claire pursuing education and career, aligned with genuine interests rather than status expectations. For Daniel, the transformation had meant reclaiming authentic purpose through teaching, reconnecting with innate values separate from parental expectations, exploring relationship based on genuine connection rather than social script. For me, the boundaries had confirmed what I'd always known but temporarily compromised, that success measured through integrity and authentic achievement would always prove more satisfying than approval purchased through self-diminishment. That financial clarity provided foundation for all other forms of honesty. That genuine connection required courage to establish limits when necessary. The journey wasn't complete for any of us. Transformation rarely arrives as finished product, more often emerging through ongoing process of adjustment, reflection, and recalibration. But the foundation had shifted from appearance to authenticity, from performance to reality, creating space for something genuinely meaningful to develop at its own organic pace. The financial boundaries I'd established had indeed changed. Everything, not by destroying what existed before, but by creating the possibility for something more authentic to finally emerge from beneath the crushing weight of appearances, expectations, and illusions. Whatever came next would be built on the solid ground of truth rather than the shifting sands of pretense, and that alone made every difficult conversation, every painful confrontation, every necessary limit completely worthwhile. As I pulled into my driveway, the home I'd purchased with early luminous profits, the space that had witnessed my entire journey of compromise and reclamation, I felt profound gratitude for boundaries that had ultimately freed everyone involved. For limits that had created possibility rather than constraint. For difficult truths that had finally made authentic connection possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.